New overnight, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth speaks in Asia but does not mention Taiwan in his prepared remarks.
We are changing the playbook. The era of performative outrage is over.
What he's saying about U.S. allies and the war in Iran, live from Singapore.
Plus, what's in a name? A federal judge says no to the Trump Kennedy Center, writing the board didn't have the power to add the president's name. How the president is reacting to the ruling.
And the U.S. plan to quarantine Americans exposed to the Ebola virus in Kenya is on hold as the head of the World Health Organization touches down in the region.
It's a very complex outbreak.
A former CDC director joins us live to talk about the response.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, coming to you live from Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura with Lisa Mateo. It is Saturday, May the 30th. A hearty welcome to our listeners and viewers across all our Bloomberg platforms on radio, TV, streaming on Bloomberg.com, of course, on the Bloomberg Business app. And Christina, this morning, we were waiting for any word from the White House. There was this moment yesterday the president was going down to the Situation Room, stayed there for 2 hours' time. Did not emerge with what he called a final determination on a path forward with the war.
No, posted before that. I will come out with a definitive decision, and that definitive decision has yet to appear. So what the reporting around it is trying to figure out what the complications are, where we are now. Also, a lot of other news this week. You know, I was filling in on Tim and Carol's show, so I'm ready to talk about tech earnings in a way that I usually would defer to you. We've got some colleagues. Tim and Carol have a heck of a show. So that's a good operation there. But, you know, look, it was a big week in tech. We've also got some colleagues at this very important security summit in Asia. We're going to talk to them live. But first, we're going to talk to Lisa Mateo, who's got the headlines.
You got it, guys. Several Americans, well, they've been injured after an Iranian ballistic missile strike on a Kuwaiti airbase. Now, this attack had also seriously damaged 2 MQ-9 Reaper strike drones. Now, those drones, well, they cost about $30 million each. Sources tell Bloomberg Kuwaiti air defenses intercepted the missile, but falling debris struck the Ali al-Salem airbase. About 5 people, including contractors and active duty personnel, suffered minor injuries. No comment from the U.S. Central Command. Now, this all comes as President Donald Trump considers a deal to extend a ceasefire, but still no announcement has been made from the president after a roughly 2-hour meeting in the Situation Room on Friday. The president is demanding that Iran abandon its nuclear program, give up its enriched uranium supplies, and open the Strait of Hormuz. At the Shangri-La Defense Conference in Singapore, Qatar's deputy prime minister said it opposes permanent legal fees for transit through the strait, but added that a temporary toll is negotiable and could help restore normal passage through the waterway. Over at the Reagan National Economic Forum in Simi Valley, California yesterday, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent suggested the Trump administration could lift certain sanctions on Iran, depending on how the standoff develops.
We put more sanctions on yesterday. We sanctioned their 2 airlines. We've got some other financial targets. There's a lot more that we can do if we have to. And there's some things that we can take off to help the Iranian people.
Bessent also suggested the Treasury will mint a coin with Trump's image on it to mark the nation's 250th anniversary. In other news, President Trump says he's backing away from his proposed renovation of the Kennedy Center and returning control of it to Congress. This comes after a federal judge blocked the Kennedy Center board from closing the performing arts venue and ordered the president's name to be removed from the building. And another setback for the Trump administration, a federal judge temporarily blocked payment for any claims to renew $1.8 billion settlement fund for the president's allies who believe they were victims of a weaponized government. The judge scheduled a June 12th hearing for arguments on whether to extend that order. David and Christina.
Lisa, thank you very much. We've got Congress out until Wednesday of this week. We'll see what happens with that fund when they get back. I know that there was a lot of angst among Republicans about it, but very little has happened over the course of this recess.
It's going to be an interesting term. There's quite a bit on their plate, and midterms are just a few months away. Thanks, Lisa. All right, new this morning, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says the U.S. is ready to restart strikes in Iran if there is no deal between the 2 countries. In a speech in Singapore, Hegseth also took some swipes at NATO allies. Speaking at the Shangri-La Dialogue, he talked about the Middle East, U.S. partnerships, and China's military expansion.
There is rightful alarm regarding China's historic military buildup and the expansion of its military activities in the region and beyond. We share a clear-eyed assessment of that security environment. and a mutual understanding that a Pacific dominated by any hegemon would unravel the regional balance of power and undermine the equilibrium we all seek to preserve. The Department of War is working with the utmost focus to prevent any such unraveling. We do not approach this challenge with needless confrontation, but with a posture of measured and deliberate strength.
On the sidelines of that important security and defense summit is our colleague Haslinda Aman, who is a Bloomberg editor-at-large and the host of Insight with Haslinda Aman on Bloomberg Television. Haslinda, always great to speak with you, and I wonder if you could set the scene for us first. Maybe pick up on what the defense secretary said there and how that's coloring the proceedings that are taking place in Singapore this weekend.
Well, you heard from Hegseth himself. I mean, it is a balancing act. The tone that Hegseth adopted this time around reflects a relationship with China, which is still being redefined. He talked about how relations are constructive, that China is possibly a partner, and that communications between the two sides are open. In fact, the two militaries are in communication. And that is what is interesting here, David. When you speak to experts, they point to how relations between the two, till now, have been lacking in communication. And that's led to some big misunderstandings, prompting to that relationship being on the brink at some point. Case in point, back in October, when the U.S. imposed heightened tariffs, and that prompted China to retaliate by withholding critical minerals to the U.S., bringing the U.S. economy to its knees. Now, that's because of a lack of communication. And I think the U.S. and China are trying to rectify that. If you take a look at what happened in Beijing just 2 weeks ago, we had President Trump, before leaving Beijing after that summit, telling Xi Jinping, you know what, call me, maybe, if there are issues between the two sides. It is an attempt to redefine that relationship, and communications are pretty much key. And you know what? It is interesting to note as well that the Pew Research recently stated what the Americans themselves think about China. They no longer think of China as an enemy, as a foe. They see China as a rival. They can coexist. And perhaps this is that defining moment.
Haslinda, it's so nice to finally get to talk to you. This is the first time I've gotten the opportunity since joining the team here. But I do want to ask you a little bit more about Hegseth before we kind of broaden out a little bit, because in this Q&A, he was also asked about future arms sales to Taiwan, and if he was able to do that. There's been reporting that those stockpiles are low, and that so there's two ways to look at this. It's either being used as a bargaining chip, as the president said, or it's being put on hold because those stockpiles are low and the U.S. will need them. What was his response, and how is that playing out at the forum?
First of all, I want to say that Taiwan is the red line in relations between the U.S. and China. Taiwan, that China has warned time and time again that if it is mismanaged, that could be severe consequences. So Taiwan really is the red line. The fact that Hegseth's speech did not mention Taiwan at all, that is a big deal, because if you recall, back in his speech a year ago, this time last year in Shanghai, he talked about Taiwan. He mentioned Taiwan 5 times. This time around, no mention of Taiwan, even though Taiwan is the key issue for the world today. It was only during the Q&A when he was asked about that deal, that arms deal, which China took issue with, that he said, you know what? President Trump will decide on that. That in itself is a reflection of how sensitive he is to the topic of Taiwan. So I think the fact that he refused to answer that question says everything.
You, of course, are watching all of the proceedings. You are participating in them as well. You're doing interviews on the sidelines here, and you spoke to NATO's military chief a little bit earlier today. And yes, the focus is very much on the Indo-Pacific, but also on Europe. There are a lot of European security and defense officials there as well. And you asked him about the relationship between the U.S. and NATO. Let's take a little bit of a listen to the colloquy that you had with the NATO military chief.
In the speech by Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War of the U.S., he talked about how there are great benefits for allies that help themselves. It seems to be a dig for Europe and NATO. How do you assess what's been relayed by Pete Hegseth?
Well, this is nothing new. We had a message loud and clear a long time ago. I think that we react. We had a commitment, a strong commitment in The Hague to reach the 5% by 2035. We are on that path. We are progressing on that. We are just doing it. We have a NATO defense planning process to give us the capability that we need, and we will acquire that in time. So I think we are in a good shape. And of course, we as a military side, we don't have any drama going on.
Cabo Dragon there. Haslin, to put that into a broader context again, the focus here among those allies still very much on President Trump's call for these European nations to contribute larger percentage of their GDP to defense. How much is that being talked about at this forum thus far?
You know what? The NATO military chief was pretty plain and clear. He talked about how they are listening to the U.S. They are bringing that defense spending up to 5%. It won't happen overnight. It will take time, but they are getting there. They have listened and they know their commitment. I think that's one. The other thing he talked about was how the relationship between the U.S. and NATO is mature. It's stable. And it will go through all these challenges, and it is adapting to the current challenges and the current time. And I think that's key. I think you need to draw that comparison with the relationship that the U.S. has with this part of the world, the Indo-Pacific, which is very much reliant on the U.S. for, I guess in a way, for lack of a better expression, protection. Mm-hmm. I mean, with the China's buildup in this part of the world, it is only a U.S.-led alliance, a U.S.-led response that can counter the defense. But in any case, I think the point to note really is the U.S. can't do anything alone. It requires NATO in Europe. It requires, the partners in this part of the world to actually counter that buildup that we see from China right now.
Certainly an argument NATO allies have been making pretty strongly to the White House. Haslin, quickly before we let you go, there is news that the New York Times has kicked out, China has kicked out the New York Times long-standing, very accomplished China reporter Vivian Wang after that outlet did an interview with a separate reporter with the president of Taiwan. Historically, China's been pretty tolerant of Taiwanese officials doing media outlet interviews, especially with American outlets. Does this mark a change? Is China cracking down, and is it concerning that this is coming on the heels of that Trump-Xi summit?
Well, it's really hard to say what really is happening because it's hard to say what U.S. policy is towards Taiwan right now. I think there is a reassessment of how the U.S. views Taiwan. Some people view that under this current administration, the Taiwan issue is no longer a key issue in America's policy towards China. There are other bigger issues that it needs to handle. So it's really hard to say whether the crackdown is continuing and how the world should be responding. I think there's a lack of clarity, and we just have to wait and see what the actual policy is towards Taiwan.
Haslin, Bloomberg editor-at-large in Singapore, thank you so much for joining us today.
Appreciate it. Well, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was also asked about Iran after President Trump ended that 2-hour meeting in the Situation Room on Friday without announcing a final determination on a deal, as we mentioned.
And I had a chance to talk to President Trump this morning. He wanted me to reiterate how patient he is in ensuring that with America undertaking this kind of historic endeavor, any deal will be a good one, a great one. And he's patient in the pursuit of that because of how the implications of how that sorts out. And certainly our department, we were in a cabinet meeting just a couple of days ago, and the president said, hey, it will be a great deal. And if Iran doesn't want to make a great deal that ensures they don't get a nuclear weapon, they can deal with the guy on my left. That was the only time I've ever been accused of being on the left. And he was pointing at the War Department. And we're serious about that. Our ability to recommence if necessary is, we are more than capable. Our stockpiles are more than suited for that, both there and around the globe, because of how we balance exquisite and more plentiful munitions.
Overnight, the White House issued a statement that reads, President Trump will only make a deal that is good for America and satisfies his red lines. Iran can never possess a nuclear weapon. Joining us now is Laura Davidson. She is Bloomberg's Deputy Washington Bureau Chief. Laura, thank you so much for joining us. First of all, it's a little bit of a deja vu all over again. I feel like we had this exact same talk last weekend, but you weren't here. So let's get your take on all this. It was very interesting yesterday. You had this pronouncement from the president, as we referenced at the top of the show, going in, huddling in the Situation Room, gonna make this decision, and now crickets. Do we have any idea where this stands or what the holdup was?
We don't. He went into the Situation Room for this 2-hour meeting. He yet again set a deadline for himself, saying that he would make a decision by the time he was coming out of this meeting. And there has been no response from the White House other than to say that the meeting happened, it concluded, and that essentially that the president's red lines, which are the opening of the Strait of Hormuz, Iran agreeing to give up its nuclear program, as well as its enriched uranium stockpile, those red lines have not yet been satisfied. So this continues to be quite a pickle for the president. We've seen Trump, kind of time and time again, try to get this deal to come together. But markets and investors and kind of the world has sort of been bracing for some sort of response. But it started to take some of these pronouncements with a grain of salt, because we've seen him now, for weeks, if not months, sort of set up a deadline that he then completely blows past. And so, it was even interesting just on the terminal yesterday, seeing what readers were reading. And there was an interesting, every True Social post he put out, people were gleaning to see if there's any information, but instead he was talking about the Kennedy Center or putting out memes, not about the one thing that it really has the world captivated, Iran.
Laura, let me ask you lastly here just about what we've heard from other administration officials. So I guess that is what's different this time. We heard from the vice president. These negotiations have been ongoing. We heard from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who's at the Reagan Forum yesterday. A lot of detail about the efficacy of the sanctions policies that have been put in place on Iran. What did he have to say, Bessent in particular, just about the strength of the vice that the U.S. has put on Iran as this conflict has continued?
Yeah, Bessent's comments came after sort of the latest round of sanctions, and he said there were more to come, potentially on airlines. He also mentioned that there was $1 billion of Iranian crypto that had been seized, that U.S. cyber forces had been able to basically go seize that money straight out of the wallets themselves, putting additional pressure on the Iranian government's finances. But the important thing to remember here is that the Iranian public and the Iranian government's threshold for pain is a lot higher than where the American populaces might be. If this is, their country, of course, it's an authoritarian country. We don't have a great sense of what's going on inside. The borders of Iran, internet has been shut down for the better part of 3 months now. And there's, even with, hunger levels rising, with, kind of an economic crisis that could potentially be brewing, there's an asymmetrical, sort of balance here on, what they might be able to withstand. Trump has sort of, pivoted to making this point that, he's patient, he's willing to make a deal, but he doesn't want to, rush to the finish line if he doesn't think that the U.S. is getting a good deal. But, he's facing a much different set of circumstances when it comes to rising gas prices and economics here in the
Laura,
US.
we're so sorry. We're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us. It's always nice to see you. I'm glad you're back in D.C.
Laura Davison, our Deputy Bureau Chief in Washington. Coming up, legacy tech companies having their moment in the sun. Mandeep Singh, Bloomberg Intelligence's Global Head of Technology Research, joins us straight ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's update you on today's top stories. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth assured Pacific allies that Washington remains committed to the region.
Together, we are enhancing our force posture and investing in the right capabilities. We're not at the finish line yet, and there's still some heavy lifting ahead, but the momentum is headed in the right direction.
Hegseth was speaking at the Shangri-La Defense Conference in Singapore. He also took swipes at long-standing partners in Europe, saying Western Europe might take note. Former Attorney General Pam Bondi, well, she refused to answer questions on President Donald Trump's involvement in the release of the Jeffrey Epstein case files. Democratic lawmakers spoke out during a break in the committee's closed-door questioning. Democratic Congresswoman Summer Lee said the fight is not over.
Right now, what we want to do and what we're committed to doing is continuing to keep the main story, that justice doesn't have a time limit. And no matter how much Comer or Bondi or Blanche or Trump or whoever else fights back against the truth coming out, that this fight will continue.
The world's biggest social media platforms have agreed to pay about $27 million to settle a lawsuit filed by a rural Kentucky school district. Now, that suit, it claims that their products are addictive and helped create a teen mental health crisis that drains school resources. Records show Meta is paying the largest share, followed by Snap, TikTok, and Google's YouTube. More than 1,300 other school districts have filed similar lawsuits, and they are awaiting trial. So there's more to come to this story.
Yes, it does feel like that dam is breaking a little bit.
It is.
Yeah, they found a strategy that was more effective than what they were trying before, and I think that's going to open up new logic chains.
Congress ain't it. It seems like not a good strategy.
Nope, legislating through the courts. All right. So 90s nostalgia is having a bit of a moment in fashion and pop culture, and the roaring 90s are back also when it comes to technology. We've got these so-called legacy tech companies, we're talking Dell, Intel, Nokia, and BlackBerry saw their stocks surging this week as they're all making turns towards AI.
This rally is very different than the boom that we've seen from other companies like OpenAI and Anthropic. Mandeep Singh joins us now. He's Bloomberg Intelligence's global head of technology research. Get on the nostalgia bandwagon here, Mandeep, and walk us through what's happening here. It does feel like there is a bit of a lag. Obviously, a lot of excitement and enthusiasm for these new upstarts now on target to be worth many hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of valuation. But what accounts for these legacy companies having a moment right now?
Well, all these companies were growing, mid to high single digit at best, top line growth. And suddenly, because everyone is looking to upgrade their infrastructure to run more AI workloads, a company like Dell is guiding to almost, 48% top line growth. And yes, they are, benefiting from a new line of AI servers, which didn't exist 2-3 years back. But when you look at the size of these companies and the way they were growing in the past decade, and now suddenly, everyone is talking about sustaining that double-digit growth, that's what's driving a reset in expectations.
Dell stock popping 33%.
It was crazy. I mean, Mandy, we did that live
notice,
on Tim and Carol's show. It was insane. The other stock that we talked about a lot this week is Snowflake, and I want to come back to that because the first thing I want to hit with you is talk to us a little bit about the difference between these kind of legacy physical AIs versus AI agents and why you're seeing more growth in one part than you are as you see almost a little bit of a slump in some of the AI softwares as users decide what they're actually getting an ROI on.
I mean, all these companies that are tied at the database layer, they're having their moment right now because when you talk about agentic deployments, you have to connect your enterprise database with these LLMs, and it's driving more queries for a company like Snowflake. And on top of that, Snowflake has launched their own coding agent, and we know coding agent is the real sort of big category of software that has emerged with the help of LLMs. So really, they are in that right spot. Obviously, initially, the market treated everyone equally in terms of, all the SaaS names getting clobbered. But now you're finding those spots within the SaaS market that are actually going to benefit with, more agentic AI, more use of coding agents. And I think Snowflake probably is one of them.
Let me pivot to the flashier, newer companies here for a moment, because I think the parlor game of the moment is the dueling IPOs, rather, between OpenAI and Anthropic. And we saw Anthropic taking the lead this week, becoming the front runner. And I'm curious how you see that binary unfolding as we push ahead to those IPOs, the way that Anthropic is positioning itself vis-a-vis OpenAI and vice versa.
Yeah, look, Anthropic started off the year at around a $10 billion revenue run rate. They're already close to $47 billion in run rate in 5 months. And the projections are they will probably end the year at a $100 billion revenue run rate. So it's a straight 10x, and they had a 10x last year as well. And these kind of hyper growth rates are really something that we haven't seen probably in the last 20, 30 years. And, when I look at OpenAI, they had the lead, but it seems like in terms of growth rates, there's no doubt that Anthropic has the advantage. And even with SpaceX, they're trying to pivot to NeoCloud. The acquisition of Cursor is a huge kind of inflection point in terms of, shifting XAI towards growth. But Anthropic is by far the leader when it comes to, these kind of growth rates, and they seem to be sustainable for the time being.
It's interesting to me that you're seeing harder investment on kind of almost like the back end of this, like the physical servers and the memory space. And while you're seeing some hesitation on the software side, depending on what the software does. And Mandeep taught me a new word this week, David Gura. Are you ready for it?
I'm ready.
I think I'm going to get it right. Disintermediation. You don't want to get disintermediated. Mandeep, what does that mean?
6 syllables if I'm counting.
And why
correct.
why does it matter? And why is it more important it's easier for some of these integrated companies to keep their market share, whereas you said ones that are like a node and an add-on can get removed more quickly.
Look at you.
Look, I learned things. Mandeep taught me things, but
Yeah.
explain it better, please, because that wasn't.
I mean, look, the computing stack is changing. And, when we think about LLMs, this sort of layer didn't exist. The model intelligence layer is a new sort of addition to the computing stack that we have, accustomed to over the past 20, 30 years. And from that perspective, you have to see what is this model layer going to do going forward versus, how the computing stack was organized before. And that's where, you want to make sure that you are part of that modern computing stack with the LLM layer. And that's where someone like Snowflake has pivoted very nicely, in terms of making sure that they're not trying to compete with the LLM layer, but really serving something that the LLM needs to deploy that agentic functionality. And that's not going to be the case for every software company. So really, the more you are adjusting your business model to make sure you're aligned with the LLM layer, I think the better prospects you have going forward.
Mandeep, you've got the OG tech companies. You've got the kind of boring, or historically boring tech companies as well. And Lisa and I sat down with Jeetu Patel, who's the president at Cisco, just to tease an interview we're going to play a little bit later in the show. And I mean, he's wildly excited about the new Cisco and all Cisco is going to do. Yes, we think of it as this networking company, but it sees great opportunity when it comes to AI, a chance to kind of reinvent itself or have a kind of renaissance as a result of AI. Are there other companies like Cisco that you're watching that are going through a similar sort of reinvention or thinking about ways in which they can kind of rebrand or reanimate themselves because of AI?
I mean, right now, everything on the hardware semiconductor side is going through a complete transformation. These were supposed to be, commoditized companies that had no pricing power. Suddenly, you look at all of the chip categories. We know hardware is in great demand, across the board because the entire computing stack is being reimagined. The traditional chips are just not good enough to, run these modern AI workloads. And that's where the compute density is what's driving these major shifts across the board.
Mandeep Singh, he is our global head of technology research here at Bloomberg. Mandeep, it was so nice spending so much time with you. Thank you for making us all quite a bit smarter. Appreciate you.
No disintermediation.
No, don't disintermediate me, David Gura.
I'm writing that one down.
I don't know if it's a verb, noun. I will figure it out.
On this Saturday. All right, SpaceX, another company preparing to go public. That could happen as soon as mid-June, as Bloomberg has reported. The company has backed off slightly from a valuation target of $2 trillion.
Trillion with a T. This is a word we say now. All right, regardless, the historic SpaceX IPO could reshape markets, but is Wall Street rushing in a bit too fast?
SpaceX is taking off. And we're not just talking about rockets.
We've never seen anything like this.
SpaceX's initial public offering is expected to raise as much as $75 billion, more than double the record-setting $29.4 billion raised by Saudi Aramco in 2019.
This is the biggest IPO of all time.
We're looking at $2 trillion in valuation.
Elon long had said that he didn't really plan on taking SpaceX public, but that was before the merger with xAI, before he needed tens of billions of dollars to build out these ambitions.
But this massive valuation is also a test. Could all this hype make it seem worth more than it is?
If it's preordained, then it becomes hard to predict how much of the buyers are buying because of fundamentals or the valuation. So then that kind of distorts the market.
Investors are buying the dream.
Sure, we all know the dream, but what about the reality?
It's a great documentary. You can watch the whole thing at Bloomberg.com/video. And we haven't talked about this yet, but the failed launch of that Blue Origin rocket earlier this week was a thing to behold as well. That was down in Florida, and just a crazy explosion on the launch pad. But made me think about the conversation that you and I had with Lauren Grush last week, just about the difficulty of getting these massive rockets into space. Still, we're kind of used to how normal this is now, how these private companies are sending these rockets into space, but there's still, as you can see there, a lot of potential difficulty, and fortunately that was an unmanned mission, no human tragedy involved there, but still many satellites on board that rocket heading to space, and these companies are having to grapple with the fact that with this technology, a lot of it is still not wholly proven yet.
I think it's been a while since we, and it's like the collective global, we saw a space race. You know, we've been in kind of this collaborative space environment where even
through
we're
the
still,
shuttle program,
exactly. You know, we're still Russia, despite what's going on with Russia and the U.S. There's still science and technology collaboration there. We forgot that at the beginning of it's hard, and when you're racing, things get missed, and when you're pushing the envelope constantly and trying new technologies, there's a risk to it. The issue is, you know, how much risk are these companies able to take on because they're not government organizations, and how much risk are stockholders willing to take on as they vie for IPOs, and whether or not that's going to impact the valuations.
And fascinating to think about that in the context of SpaceX, which, as we've discussed on the show many times, is a company, yes, that shoots rockets into space, but is now so much more than that, has this huge AI component, has a satellite component as well. And really, when you break down the figures ahead of this IPO, those are the things that are making that company more money than this rocket program, which is the center of it, but still
the internet. I've lost the name of it. The Starlink. Thank you, Starlink, which is, you know, if you've traveled and covered war zones, is something that a lot of countries really rely on. So, all right, Pakistan is playing a critical role in the U.S.-Iran peace negotiations. How the Middle East nation sees itself in this moment. You're watching Bloomberg This Weekend.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. And Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin is assessing damage to its Florida launch pad after its New Glenn rocket exploded during a test firing Thursday night. Emergency officials there warning the public to avoid any wreckage that actually might wash ashore and instead call 911. New Glenn is the rocket that Blue Origin plans to use to launch landers to the moon for NASA. Pizza Hut, well, it may be under new ownership. Sources tell Bloomberg Yum Brands is in exclusive talks to sell the pizza chain to Long Range Capital. Now, Long Range reportedly entered exclusivity with Yum in recent days, beating out bidders that include Sycamore Partners. Over to sports now. Another tennis great has been knocked out of the French Open after a surprise upset from Jannik Sinner on Thursday. Novak Djokovic is now out of the running. He was defeated by Brazilian teenager João Fonseca. Also out, the men's major winners. And the PGA tournament continues at Colonial Country Club in Fort Worth, Texas. Topping the leaderboard is Jordan Smith at 10 under par, followed by a four-way tie for second that includes three Americans. David, help me with this one.
Bjornsson?
There you go. Ryan Durant and Brian Harmon.
Well done, Lisa.
Let's go to where I know, the NBA playoffs.
Buddy, you got it.
Tonight, the Knicks, they're going to actually find out who they play in the finals because you have the San Antonio Spurs taking on the Oklahoma City Thunder. That series tied at 3 apiece. Let's go to hockey right now because this is David's, okay?
Right.
Carolina Hurricanes top the Montreal Canadiens 6-1, which means they will take on the Vegas Golden Knights in the Stanley Cup Finals on Tuesday. Carolina, David.
Carolina.
Yes.
You know, I grew up in North Carolina. It was a big deal when the Hurricanes came there, and they've been quite good. I mean, the southeastern hockey is a thing to behold.
That's
anyway,
fun. All right.
Love that pronunciation, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks for the help.
Coming up next block.
All right. On Friday, Secretary of State Marco Rubio met with Pakistan's foreign minister in Washington.
America's top diplomat thanked Pakistan for its role in, quote, realizing President Trump's vision for peace in the Middle East and its mediation efforts with Iran. Earlier this week, Dave and I caught up with our friend from the Associated Press, Philip Crowther. He was here in New York. He, of course, is their international correspondent, and he talked about those efforts to end the war in the Middle East.
Pakistanis are really proud, to be honest, of the role that they are playing. They really weren't expecting to have
this isn't something
this
they really
intermediary
do that
role.
Often, yeah.
No, not necessarily. It's brand new. People are in Islamabad, despite the road closures for a long time, still very enthusiastic about this role that Pakistan is playing. And they are confident that they will keep this role, even if things have slowed down on the diplomatic front. They still think if there are going to be, let's not call them peace talks for now, but if there are going to be negotiations or just the signing of a memorandum of understanding, anything between Iran and the United States, they still think that is going to be in Islamabad. There are other candidates out there, the more traditional intermediaries, if you will, Qatar, Turkey, for example. They're ready to jump in if they have to. But I think for now it's Islamabad where this story is going to unfold. Now, there are reasons Iran trusts Pakistan quite a lot right now. And the United States, of course, the Trump administration in this case, trusts Pakistan as well. You've heard this many times. We've spoken about this on air. President Trump likes the Pakistanis. He likes the field marshal a lot. He says it again and again.
Personality driven. This is this one guy who's made a heck of a name for himself.
Isn't it always? He is considered pretty much the most powerful person in Pakistan, where the army has traditionally held a very important role. And he is still liked by President Trump. And that is probably the main reason why things are going to happen in Islamabad when they do. I've applied for my next visa. We're ready to go. And we do think it's going to be Islamabad most likely. But, you know, you spoke about the time that I spent there. It was a lot of time spent waiting after that first round of talks. Then there was the possibility of another round of talks happening in the future. Road closures remained. At one point, we actually thought that the delegations, or at least one of them, was in the air. They were not. And now things are a little bit back to normal over there. So as soon as, you know, I have my sources there who will tell me whether talks are coming or not. But they don't have to be the highest ranking sources. They can also be someone just telling me the roadblocks are happening.
Or the posters are back up.
Or they've booked out the entire hotel.
Yes. And then we'll be heading over there again.
All right, speaking of more traditional negotiators, before the rounds in Pakistan, you also had these negotiations in Geneva with the Omanis. And when we were talking to our sources before, they were telling me that it was a signal that the administration wasn't serious about not having some sort of a conflict with Iran. This is before everything started, obviously, because the Omanis are very methodical, they're very traditional, and this administration doesn't like that. We are now seeing the Omanis floating the idea of getting together with Iran and possibly tolling the Strait. And we have some sound. The president had a very strong reaction to that earlier this week.
The Strait's going to be open to everybody.
And who would control it?
It's international waters. Nobody's going to control it. We're going to watch over it. We'll watch over it, but nobody's going to control it. That's part of the negotiation that we have. They would like to control it. Nobody's going to control it. It's international waters, and Oman will behave just like everybody else, so we'll have to blow them up. They understand that. They'll be fine.
And we actually were checking to make sure the president didn't misspeak.
I wasn't sure.
It's fair, but then the State Department retweeted it, so it confirmed that he did in fact mean Oman,
not Iran. Yeah.
As you look at where these Gulf allies are, and as they're struggling to come up with some sort of way forward, what do you think the odds are that you start seeing more defections from the bloc of GCC states negotiating en masse with the Trump administration, people working out their own deals with Iran just to get back to business?
You know, it's a good question because Oman has been hit as well by Iran, and they, of course, have joint control over the Strait of Hormuz. We don't really mention Oman, do we? Because Iran has just taken over and is making money off traffic going through the Strait of Hormuz. But Oman does have joint control, and Oman has been a negotiating partner, if you will, but more of an intermediary between the United States and Iran in the past. Of course, you've mentioned this. Talks have happened in Muscat, in the capital of Oman in the past, Geneva as well, another place where talks have happened. Now, we've been asking ourselves this while we've been reporting from the Gulf a lot. What are these countries going to do? At what point are they going to jump off, if you will? As in, they were in a purely defensive position throughout this conflict. This is the United Arab Emirates, this is Saudi Arabia, all the other Gulf countries as well, being hit, not successfully a lot of the time, but receiving a lot of drones and missiles. And, you know, their air defenses have been very good during this war. So they haven't been hit that hard, but they've essentially stayed defensive. We will shoot down these drones, we'll shoot down these missiles, but we won't attack Iran for now. It's always been that question, at what point will they essentially be fed up with this situation?
Let's bring this full circle. A treat to have you here in New York, but you're traveling a lot, you're covering a lot of these conflicts, and I wonder how much the nature of that work has changed when you look at what's happening in the Middle East, certainly what's happening in Ukraine. We talk a lot to experts who track that war. We don't have a front line in a kind of traditional sense. How is your job different as a result of the way that these conflicts are being
I'll tell you what, my family members are very happy that
there is no front line.
I'm not covering, I can say that I cover wars. I like to say that I cover countries that are at war, not necessarily war zones, if you will. Even if I wanted to, I think it might be a little bit difficult to get there. So my family's pretty happy that I don't do war zones in the traditional sense. And if you look at the latest conflict we just discussed, you can't get into Iran really either. Some correspondents have. I think it's essentially been essentially one TV correspondent per week has been able to get in. But all of that is heavily controlled, of course. That doesn't mean that reporters are being censored, but it's still very difficult to get inside Iran. So a lot of these wars, again, it's safer, but we're watching them from the outside, if you will. Look at the US-Israeli war on Iran. Most of it, yes, the Strait of Hormuz, you're close to the action, if you will. You're close to seeing the effects of the war. But then the rest of it, I at least have been covering it from Dubai, where locals tell me that they consider this a 5-star war, meaning that you can still have a pretty luxurious lifestyle if you live in Dubai and still hear the occasional drone that is almost always going to be shot down. Dubai, by the way, has changed hugely. I'm sure you've discussed it here as well. No tourists, essentially. The hotels are very, very cheap right now because no one is coming in. It's a very strange situation. The locals, if you will, whoever you put in that category, be they expatriates or the local workers from neighboring countries, for example, they largely have remained there. So life kind of does continue. So you're covering a war from, yes, a pretty luxurious place like Dubai, and you're kind of trying to hear maybe the occasional drone or a fighter jet overhead, and that is kind of as close as you're going to get to feeling like you're reporting on a war. That's kind of the reality in all of those conflicts right now.
All right, well, wherever you go next, we hope you'll have a live shot.
We'll find you.
And we'll find you. We're happy to have you on. So nice to have you here in New York.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini. That's David Gura. We've already talked about disintermediation.
We have.
Now we're going to talk about deregulation. It is, of course, one of President Trump's favorite words.
We're ending high prices with tax cuts, deregulation, and frankly, again, the words common sense. My first 4 years, we did more deregulation than any other president in history. The single largest deregulatory action in American history.
Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy wrote an op-ed about it. President Trump has signed executive orders about it. And last spring, he told federal agencies to fast-track it without normal notice and public comment periods.
So are they doing it? Bloomberg Law did an exclusive analysis and found the White House plan to cut through regulations has flopped. We asked Robert Iafolla of Bloomberg Law why.
The first Trump administration had some problems with this because federal law places a lot of requirements on what it takes to repeal a regulation. It's basically you have to go through a similar process as to create a regulation. So one of the shortcuts they were hoping to use was basically this exception to this law called the Administrative Procedure Act. And this is an exception that allows you to skip all of this burdensome rulemaking procedure. It's called the good cause exception. It's traditionally used in emergencies or to get rid of rules that are, just ticky-tacky and uncontroversial. So the administration came up with a plan to expand the use of this to say when an agency deems that a rule is illegal, particularly illegal under one of a list of 10 Supreme Court cases, then they could go ahead and dispense with that sort of laborious multi-year rulemaking process and just go ahead and wipe it out directly.
So that was the plan, and you had the administration kind of hammering that point home, directing agencies to do this. You have done an analysis of how much this has actually been put into effect, and what did you learn from doing that analysis?
Yeah, so when they rolled out this plan, this was early in 25. It was when Doge was running all over the place. It seemed like the administration could do just about anything, no matter what the law said. And when I spoke to people then, there was a wonder about how this would actually land. But after a year plus since it was rolled out, what we found was that it was not widely adopted at all. It was essentially a non-starter with agencies. There were just a handful of examples. They were primarily clustered around anti-DEI moves where agencies cited the Supreme Court ruling from a few years ago in which the court basically got rid of race-based affirmative action in universities and used that as a justification for getting rid of some small programs that would advantage like minority-owned business and things like that. But the scale of the effort, a year plus ago to what the actual results are, there's a rather wide delta there.
And what does that tell you? Does it show that this wasn't effective, that there was concern about using this legal framework? What conclusions can we draw from how infrequently it has been used?
Yeah, so the White House didn't talk to me about this, but in talking to former government regulators and administrative law experts, the consensus was that this is evidence that administration lawyer or agency lawyers, I should say, the general counsels at these different agencies sort of took a look at this and decided that it's not really tenable. There's not the amount of litigation that they would face and the prospect of losing just didn't justify using this shortcut.
I want to take a step back here lastly to go back to that idea that I brought up at the top, that is kind of reforming the regulatory landscape. Are there places where they have been more successful? I look at these kind of committees and commissions. I look at the SEC. It's not fully staffed with commissioners. It seems like aside from rules, they have been able to make inroads here in neutering the sort of regulatory apparatus that the federal government has.
100%. If you're taking a step back and you're looking at what the Trump administration has done vis-a-vis the regulatory state, you're talking about, radically shrinking regulatory agencies. Some agencies don't have enough regulators to sort of police their beat, so to speak. You have other instances like with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where the administration tried to essentially eliminate the entire agency. When a court stopped them from doing that, they basically have sidelined the agency. They have repealed some rules going through the full process that are very meaningful. So it's not to say that the administration hasn't done things to impede the efforts of regulators to sort of police the beat, but just this specific initiative to quickly, rip through the Code of Federal Regulations with the good cause exception has kind of flopped. And one reason why that's important is because things like shifting enforcement priorities and shrinking agencies, those are very, very impactful, but those are a little bit easier to reverse by future administrations, where this idea of repealing regulations, it's burdensome, it's costly, it takes a long time. So if you repeal a reg and a new administration comes in and wants to bring it back, they can't just snap their fingers and bring it back.
Robert Iafallo, thank you very much. Appreciate the time. All right, we're coming up on 8 o'clock Wall Street time here in New York.
That's right. The next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts right now.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. It is 8 a.m. here in New York. We're coming to you live from Bloomberg World Headquarters. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura, alongside Lisa Mateo. We are bringing you the latest breaking news, reporting, and analysis live this morning and every Saturday and Sunday morning from 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock. And our focus right now is on Singapore, where over the course of the last 15, 16 hours, we've had a parade of defense officials and security officials talking about, yes, the Indo-Pacific, but also turning their attention to Europe and the Middle East as well.
That's right. It's an interesting time. I mean, we've talked about this before, but every administration, it seems, tries to pivot to Asia and then gets distracted by other world events. We, topic-wise, are actually pivoting to Asia, talking to some of our colleagues who are out there and who are covering this forum, because it's a really interesting time to be these countries, right? They are, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, they are under a lot of pressure politically. They're trying to find their place between China and the United States without antagonizing either one. And you're doing this at a time of a global energy crisis and evolving technology.
With 2 shooting wars underway in the Middle East and Ukraine as well. We'll get to
Exactly
that in
right.
just a moment. Our colleagues, as Christina says, are over there. But first, let's get a check of the headlines. Lisa Mateo. Lisa?
You got it. And several Americans, they have been injured after an Iranian ballistic missile strike on a Kuwaiti air base. Now, that attack, it also seriously damaged 2 MQ-9 Reaper strike drones. Those drones, they cost about $30 million each. Sources telling Bloomberg that Kuwaiti air defenses, they intercepted the missile, but falling debris struck the Ali Al Salem air base. About 5 people, including contractors and active duty personnel, suffered minor injuries. No comment from the U.S. Central Command. Now, this all comes as President Donald Trump considers a deal to extend a ceasefire, but still no announcement has been made from the president after a roughly 2-hour meeting in the Situation Room on Friday. The president is demanding that Iran abandon its nuclear program, give up its enriched uranium supplies, and open the Strait of Hormuz. At the Shangri-La Defense Conference in Singapore, Qatar's deputy prime minister, well, he said it opposes permanent legal fees for transit through the strait, but added that a temporary toll is negotiable and could help restore normal passage through that waterway. Meanwhile, a plume of smoke was seen rising over northern Israel in the early hours of Saturday morning. Fighting between Israel and Hezbollah continues. In a statement, the Israeli military said, quote, several projectiles were fired from Lebanon into northern Israel. No injuries were reported. It comes after a 6-member Lebanese military delegation met Friday in Washington with Israeli military officials in the first direct military talks between the two countries in decades. In other news, President Trump says he's backing away from his proposed renovation of the Kennedy Center and returning control of it to Congress. Now, it comes after a federal judge had blocked the Kennedy Center board from closing the performing arts venue and ordered the president's name to be removed from the building. And the rescue divers in Laos have safely evacuated the first of 5 local villagers who had been trapped in a cave for more than a week by floodwaters. 2 were still missing. The villagers, they had reportedly entered the cave last week to look for valuable minerals before being trapped by flash flooding. 1 other villager escaped and alerted the authorities to the 7 that were left behind. David and Christina.
You watched that documentary about the Thai cave?
No,
that was
I
a
did
wild.
not.
I mean, that was a crazy story, but the efforts that they went through to get those that soccer team, those children out of the cave.
I remember
was a
covering
wild
that story. It was just really terrifying.
It lasted for weeks, but
I would like to say to everyone on set with me here today, please do not go cave diving.
Fair enough.
There are other things you can do. No cave diving.
Don't amble around them.
Okay, I'll stay away.
All right, thank you.
Noted. Thank you,
This is
Christina.
my
Thank you,
proclamation.
Lisa.
All right, turning now to actual news. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth just spoke with reporters at the Shangri-La Dialogue, reassuring Pacific allies of U.S. support while also reiterating the president's focus on an Iran peace deal.
President Trump is laser focused on a great deal in Iran, has the patience to see it through in historic fashion to make sure they never have a nuclear weapon. At the same time, I'm out here on his behalf to ensure that our Pacific allies know exactly where America stands and that we're prepared to defend our interests, stand with our allies, and project power halfway around the world. And you see that through our national defense strategy. Yes, we're focused on the homeland and our hemisphere, but our ability to project power into the Pacific is central to how we plan and to how we work with our allies and partners.
Pete Hegseth just a few moments ago. Joining us now from the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, a defense and security summit, is Jerry Doyle. He's Bloomberg's global defense editor. Jerry, great to speak with you as always. I wonder if you could start just by summarizing the remarks that we heard from Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense. Yes, there was a formal speech. I gather he didn't mention Taiwan directly over the course of it. Then there was this kind of Q&A that followed it, and we saw the comments that he made to reporters there at the end. Summarize all of that for us, the tack that he's taking there at this important summit in Singapore.
Yeah, well, I was in the room for the speech, and hearing the entirety of it and not hearing Taiwan come up, not hearing Iran come up, it was a little jarring. Those are 2 of the top of mind issues in defense and security globally, and certainly here in Asia. He did take some questions afterward. One of them mentioned Taiwan. He sort of addressed it very briefly, but did not make any sort of additional comments about what was going to happen with the $14 billion arms package that is being proposed for Taiwan, but that President Trump has not yet approved. Many of his comments in general didn't deviate very far at all from things he had said previously about U.S. wanting to project power around the region, wanting to promote peace through strength, encouraging allies and partners here in the Indo-Pacific region to spend more on defense. He even sort of took the time to make a little bit of a swipe at America's European allies, who have increased defense spending considerably in the last 2 years, but still in the minds of the Trump administration are not doing enough, certainly not helping in the Persian Gulf to open up the Strait of Hormuz, which is a massive priority for the administration at the moment.
Take note, he said, to Western Europe.
That's right. I wonder what you're hearing in reaction to the things said and not said from those Asian allies. I think specifically about Vietnam, South Korea, Japan. These are countries that previous administrations and the previous Trump administration, when I covered Secretary Pompeo, I think we went to Vietnam 3, 4, 5 times because that was an alliance that the administration thought could be very useful in that region. And trying to break down these historic animosities between South Korea and Japan and Vietnam to try to get them all on the same security footing, that effort has not been there, partially because the administration has had other things to do. But do these allies feel like when they reach out for the U.S., that the U.S. will consistently be there? And in lieu of that, in lieu of even having it spoken about to their satisfaction, what do?
Well, first of all, one thing that several people mentioned to me over the course of the day after the speech is that the way the U.S. sort of treats its allies and partners in Asia versus the way it treats its allies and partners in Europe might be reflective of the sort of threat that it sees, that it sort of sees China as a large and powerful adversary, and maybe Russia, which is a primary threat in the European theater, and perhaps not quite so much. And indeed, to your point about how countries here in the Indo-Pacific see the U.S. relationship, it does feel, and this is something again that I've heard over the course of the day several times, it does feel as though it is perhaps more transactional now than it used to be.
Interesting.
That relying on the U.S. to step in and be a partner is also sort of slightly contingent now on doing more of the types of things that the U.S. wants them to, even if they aren't necessarily in the best interest of the country's industry or other aspects.
Jerry, stay with us if you will. We're going to bring in Dana Khraiche down to the conversation. She's our UAE bureau chief, and I want to kind of broaden out the conversation to talk about what's going on in the Middle East and indeed what's happening in Washington. We had the president absconding to the Situation Room yesterday for 2 hours. We were expecting some indication from him after that meeting, Dana, of where things were headed. He had talked a lot about this potential one-page proposal that had been passed back and forth via Pakistan between Iran and the U.S., and yet he emerged from that room with nothing in hand, nothing beyond a statement that the White House issued overnight. What do you make of this? And we've all kind of been wrestling with a feeling of deja vu over the last many weekends, a lot of jawboning about there being a potential deal and then not seeing that reciprocated by the Iranians mostly. Where do things stand now, and what do you take away from what's happened here over the last 24 hours?
Yes, indeed. I think lots of mixed signals that we've been writing for the past 2 days, that's throwing any potential deal really in doubt. We saw yesterday President Trump, as you have mentioned, went into the Situation Room, and he was supposed to, as he said, make a quote unquote final determination about this preliminary deal. And that would, essentially include a ceasefire, extending the ceasefire for 60 days, and that would allow them to discuss more thorny issues like, of course, the nuclear program of Iran. But we saw U.S. officials kind of playing that down and talking about the red lines. But that tweet and the fact that he wanted to make this final determination really sent a very strong signal to the market that this deal could be announced soon. And we saw a lot of movement in the market in that regard. And that is, of course, because it came after reports that U.S. officials saying, we and the Iranians agreed on an MOU. And then, of course, Iran came out and said through its state-run media, as they always do, that, we have agreed, but it hasn't yet been finalized. So there is a lot of back and forth, and I think this is going to be very difficult to really hone in on a deal. President Trump is, as we know, is of course under massive pressure from, the rise of gasoline prices in the U.S., rising inflation fears, Republican, hawks who want a better deal out of Iran to rein in Tehran once and for all, and of course, international pressure to end this war and reopen Hormuz. And he himself said once that he doesn't do bad deals. So he is looking for the optimal way to get out of this war and have a deal with Iran.
About the Strait of Hormuz, I'm interested that we heard from the Qatari defense minister at this forum saying that they would possibly be okay with a temporary, some sort of toll going through the strait. This comes after we saw similar ovations from Oman. Now, keep in mind, Oman had once hosted these negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. Sources tell me they were very upset at how that all played out. You had Omanis saying, well, maybe they would be okay with, charging a toll through the strait. You have Qatar now saying, well, if it was temporary and if it was done to help fund demining efforts. As you look at this frustration around the Gulf from Gulf Arab allies waiting and waiting time and time again for the U.S. to work this out, do you think you're going to see more nations trying to negotiate their own way forward, either unilaterally or in smaller groups without the United States?
I think a lot of them are waiting to see how Iran will, or how the deal is going to formalize, whether it's going to formalize Iran's, toll system with Oman, and the U.S. has said this is a no-go. And we saw from President Trump time and time again, there will be no tolls. Although the Iranians now, they set up the, Hormuz Authority, and they've been saying, us and the Omanis are talking about managing the Strait of Hormuz. And what the Qatari minister is saying, that we will not accept tolls, but maybe a temporary fee that would allow the flow. Now, there has been a flow of some ships, as we have reported too, and there is some hope there, right? Ship owners are becoming more optimistic about this pickup in traffic through Hormuz, and we saw 2 more vessels leaving the waterway with the U.S. providing information on that exit. Some ships that crossed belong to companies that hadn't even transited since the war began, and we saw the UAE is also sending ships through the strait, and the UAE's rhetoric has been quite hostile against Iran and how the war played out and how many attacks it had to endure during the war. So doubtful that it is kind of in contact with the Iranians to allow these ships through. And of course, Qatar itself, we had done a story about this, I think about a week or a half ago, that Qatar is also quietly exporting LNG to key buyers. So there is some movement in the Strait of Hormuz that's giving a little bit of hope. But of course, the Strait and how Iran is, the Strait is what markets are looking at, right? It is when it will open and how much will this flow start coming in. And of course, and as these energy markets or energy market experts like even the Emiratis here and the head of these state oil companies are saying, even if Hormuz opens today, flows will not return to pre-war levels. And that's what the market is looking for, and how we're going to price oil futures.
And also going back in is a whole different prospect than the few ships who have been able to get out, right?
Yeah, we had Mike Wirth, the CEO of Chevron, on yesterday, say that they wouldn't pay these tariffs, these tolls. So
or fees or whatever you want to call them. Yeah.
Jared, let me go back to you. I know from your perch in Singapore, you've been paying attention to what's been happening in Kuwait at the Ali Al Salam Air Base. There was an attack there, and it makes me wonder just about what the president and Iran are negotiating over here, the continuation of this ceasefire. It has been a oddly kinetic ceasefire. We've seen the U.S. using a lot of military might toward Iran here in the last few days in particular. And I understand from your reporting a couple of $30 million drones affected by the strikes that took place there in Kuwait. Just get us up to speed on what we know of that, and maybe pulling back. I imagine this dovetails nicely with what you've been hearing a lot about at that conference. That is, the U.S.'s military capacity, having used a lot of this expensive ammunition, these missiles in Iran, how that stands the U.S. as it looks to Asia here going forward.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, there are concerns that the U.S. might be a little bit preoccupied with the war in Iran, with the campaign there, and not able to sort of keep its eye on the ball in the Indo-Pacific. Pete Hegseth, of course, sort of addressed that this morning and said, that we can do many things at once, and we're here for our partners. But more tangibly, the U.S. has burned through stockpiles of quite a few rare and valuable weapons, such as long-range cruise missiles, such as air defense missiles, and those, you can't use words to imagine or pretend those things aren't happen or those deficits don't exist. They have to be replaced. It will take time and money. And in the meantime, the U.S. is going to prioritize its own needs for those weapons over its allies. You've seen that in the last week or two, where Switzerland has sort of gotten told that it will be at the back of the line now for a Patriot PAC-3 interceptor. Countries out here are obviously concerned that something like that will happen with them as well. In terms of the ceasefire and the way that the sort of kinetic activity might affect that, I mean, it's really hard to say. There has been, a lot of shooting since the ceasefire went into effect in April. The fact that this particular missile strike injured some Americans, maybe that crosses some sort of a threshold, maybe it doesn't. It's not even clear that the deal that's being considered, which extends by 60 days, a ceasefire that was already sort of indefinite anyway, how much of a lift is being asked there. So without knowing the answer to the question, it's impossible to say the impact, but the timing is certainly awkward. An Iranian ballistic missile strike that injures Americans, that destroys extensive American military hardware, just as the U.S. is, as you said, Trump trying to make a final determination about the deal. It's awkward timing.
Jerry Doyle, thank you very much. Joining us from Singapore, Global Defense Editor, and Dana Khraiche joining us from the UAE, our Bureau Chief there. Appreciate your time on this Saturday as well. And Christina, just again, interesting to watch these conversations taking place from that remove from Singapore, where the focus very much is, as Jerry was pointing out, on Europe and on the Middle East.
In an interconnected, globalized world, It all matters. And speaking of, coming up next, we're going to talk to the CDC director, former CDC director, Tom Frieden, to talk about the Ebola outbreaks and America's response. That is straight ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend. Stick with us.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's update you on today's top stories. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, he assured Pacific allies that Washington remains committed to the region.
Our focus is strong, quiet, and clear. Strong, quiet, clear. Clear about our intentions, our priorities, and our ability to deliver on the administration's goals. This is a model our Asian partners vastly prefer and have long followed.
Hegseth was speaking at the Shangri-La Defense Conference in Singapore. He also took swipes at long-standing partners in Europe. Well, to the war in Ukraine, where 3 people were injured in a Russian strike in southeastern Ukraine. That's according to the State Emergency Service. The strike also damaged residential buildings and cars. Ukraine's air defense says Russian forces launched 232 drones against Ukraine regions overnight, 217 of which were intercepted. Charred rubble. It's all that remains after an apartment building in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas exploded into a massive fireball. 3 people were killed, several more injured. Initial reports indicated a contractor had damaged an underground gas pipeline. David and Christina, over to you.
Lisa, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, the global health community is trying to contain a fast-moving Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Meanwhile, new questions are emerging about global preparedness as the U.S. begins to screen passengers for signs of infection, and Kenya temporarily blocks plans for a quarantine facility that would be backed and run by the U.S. Joining us now is Dr. Tom Frieden. He's the former director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and now the president and CEO of the organization Resolve to Save Lives. Dr. Frieden, great to have you with us. I confess the reason that I wanted to have you on is we were speaking with Jeremy Conondike last week about this outbreak as it unfolded. And he said back when he was running point for USAID in 2014, 2015, this was your full-time job, that you as the head of the CDC had a complete focus on the Ebola outbreak. I'm curious, as you look at the response thus far, if you have confidence that somebody within this administration is doing just that, paying as much attention to this outbreak and focusing on containing it.
Well, I'm not directly involved, so I can only comment as an outsider. I do see the U.S. providing some financial assistance, and I do see many scientists, doctors, nurses, lab experts at CDC very dedicated to trying to stop things. But it is a world of difference. And I think first we have to start with what the context is. This is going to be really hard to control. Just to give you a flavor of that, by the time we started responding in 2014, there were between 40 and 50 cases. By the time the world started responding this year, there are between 400 and 500 cases.
And why is that? Is that
because
partially because the reporting structure was reliant on things like USAID that are just no longer there?
You know, to be blunt, I think that's what some people are saying. I think that's a knee-jerk response. It may or may not be correct. I don't know that. There are plenty of reasons to explain a delayed detection without that. And there'll be plenty of time to assess whether or not that contributed. The point right now is we need an emergent, immediate, meticulous response just so quickly. I can't express just how important it is to work with urgency. And the reason for that is with Ebola, what we figured out in West Africa, and I went there multiple times and worked with the teams. We had fantastic staff. You know, when I ran CDC, all 158 disease detectives went to Ebola. Went to respond to the Ebola outbreak at some point. We had close to 4,000 people working. Within days, we had put 50 people in the field in the 3 countries. We had on average 200 people a day in the field, 400 working at CDC for years of this outbreak. But what we found early on was that if you get there in days, you can stop it in weeks. If it takes weeks to get there, it's going to go on for months. And if it takes months, it may go on for years. So we really need to surge in support, understanding that 90% of the response will be local doctors, nurses, community leaders, but still they need funds, they need logistics, and they need some partnership on some of the more specialized elements of care and disease detection and control.
Walk us through what you make of the plan that was floated, I guess it's been struck down by a Kenyan court here, to have a quarantine facility in Kenya for those from the U.S. who have been exposed to Ebola. What do you make of that? I know that some pushback against this that I've seen is that if you have been exposed, there's no way for you to get back to the U.S. to get treatment here. What do you make of the plan that has been floated there by the U.S. government?
Yeah, I don't know the details of it, but fundamentally, if we're talking about people who are going over to fight the epidemic, that's kind of equivalent to our warfighters who we send into danger areas. And if they get hurt, we expect to bring them back to this country and treat them as the returning heroes they are, not to put them in some slapped together facility somewhere. The other thing to say is it really is important that people get good quality care as quickly as possible if they become ill. Even though there's no proven treatment for this particular strain of Ebola, supportive care makes a really big difference. It can make the difference between life and death. We stopped the 2014-2016 epidemic without a significant contribution from vaccination or treatment. So it's possible to do with the core public health activities of isolating patients, providing safe and dignified burial, contact tracing, and then quarantine and care for contacts who become ill.
Given where this outbreak is right now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said, quote, "We cannot and will not allow any cases of Ebola to enter the United States." Do you think that's a reasonable goal? And was that the goal in the past for these kinds of epidemics?
Well, it's certainly a goal. How realistic it is if this spreads widely in Africa is very questionable. People travel for business, for tourism, for family reunification. People have contacts. People go from one country to another and then come here. So really, there's no way to build a moat around the United States and keep everybody out. It is reasonable to reduce the risk that there will be any spread in the US, and there are really good ways to do that. But what we did during my time leading the CDC was when a couple of Americans got sick overseas, we have a special biocontainment airplane that went, picked them up and brought them to a biocontainment facility at Emory University in Atlanta. And both of them survived and nobody else got infected. And that didn't serve as a deterrent for people to go stop the outbreak there, understanding that they would be well cared for if they became ill.
I remember that. I remember that flight coming back and us live on the air where I was working at the time, tracking that movement of that patient all the way to that hospital.
Let me ask you, Dr. Frieden, about the loneliness of the WHO director making the trip to Democratic Republic of the Congo to see this firsthand. In the past, somebody in your previous position might have gone. We don't currently have a permanent head of the CDC right now. Use that as a jumping off point, if you would, just to talk about the way that the WHO, the global health apparatus, is operating here without the cooperation of the kind of hand-in-glove relationship that we would have seen in the past between the U.S. public health infrastructure and global public health infrastructure.
There's a bottom line here. For all of its problems and challenges and weaknesses, the WHO is absolutely essential. There is no replacement for it. There's no way for bilateral engagements to make the kind of interaction and intervention that the WHO can. And the stronger WHO is, the safer we are as a country. During my time at WHO, Margaret Chan was the director. She and I were in almost daily telephone communication. We were very closely coordinated. We provided dozens or even hundreds of staff to support and strengthen WHO. In the past decade, WHO has gotten stronger. They created a new emergencies unit that's more capable of responding to things like this. But the US was always in the lead along with WHO, and now we're really kind of on the sidelines. And that also means that we have less intelligence, less information about what's really happening. We haven't paid our dues to WHO. We walked away from WHO. We pulled out overnight several dozen CDC experts who were embedded with WHO, helping them to do a better job. And fundamentally, when we turn our back on an organization like WHO, we can't improve it, and we are less safe.
Talk to us a little bit about what this virus is like and what this strain of this virus is like. It's not as contagious as something like COVID, right? You have to come into direct contact with it. But I think the reason it is so scary is because the outcomes can be very bad. If you are in a facility that is not what you've got in Atlanta, which is not all this supportive care, how do you treat it? And what is the best way to prevent the spread given the resources a lot of people have at their disposal?
Ebola is a scary disease. It kills a significant proportion of the people who are infected. It kills in some horrible ways, including bleeding and loss of body fluids. And it spreads through close contact, especially with people who have died from Ebola, who have a huge number of organisms. And that's one of the reasons it's just not in the cards for Ebola to spread widely in this country. We don't have the kind of burial practices or healthcare that would lead to widespread transmission. On the other hand, it is certainly possible that a traveler will come into this country, as one did in 2014, 2015, with Ebola or without Ebola and develop symptoms of Ebola, go to an emergency department or a doctor's office. And that's why for the general public, there's really no cause for concern. For doctors and nurses working on the front lines, keep an eye out for people who have traveled. But there's one issue beyond this that I think is really important to emphasize. Even though this strain of Ebola and this Ebola outbreak is not going to cause a pandemic, it's not going to cause a significant risk to large numbers of Americans, it's a stress test. And it's a stress test the world is not doing well at. I would say so far we're failing. And that bodes ill for the future. That means that the next time there's a pandemic, and there will be a next pandemic, we are not well prepared. Our defenses are down. The WHO needs to be stronger. The CDC needs to be robust. And what we saw in recent weeks is another deadly blow to the US CDC. In the past, we've seen 3,000 staff pushed out, virtually all leaders of the CDC gone acting part-time. Now what we've seen is the State Department halt more than 100 different contracts CDC has with organizations around the world that provide care for 8 million people living with HIV and that can support finding problems quickly and stopping them soon. That plan is to roll out in the coming weeks, and it would result basically in the CDC having to call back hundreds of disease detectives, shut offices, outposts in countries where we can support countries to find and stop outbreaks faster. This is something that would not only devastate CDC's global health footprint, but make Americans much less safe. So if this plan of the State Department isn't paused and done in a careful, thoughtful way, we will be even less prepared for the next pandemic.
Tom Frieden, thank you very much for the time on this Saturday. The former head of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, of course, former commissioner for public health here in New York City as well, now with the Resolve to Save Lives organization. And I just want to note here, Christina, we've gotten these kind of daily digests from the State Department. The most recent statement that we got, yes, announced more financial commitments, but also noted that the U.S., Mexico, and Canada have announced aligned public health travel measures for individuals coming from African regions at greatest risk from the Ebola virus, centering around the World Cup. And I think that's something to watch here as well, sort of how they handle that transit to the U.S. from Africa.
100%. That team is already in Europe, so we'll have to see if they're treated as a quarantine as well. All right. Everything is bigger in Texas, including the primary upsets. We've got two Texas experts to talk about the Lone Star State when we come back. Stick with us. It's Bloomberg This Weekend.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's update you on today's top stories. Another tennis great has been knocked out of the French Open. So after a surprise upset from Jannik Sinner on Thursday, Novak Djokovic is now out of the running. He was defeated by Brazilian teenager João Fonseca, also out all the men's major winners. The PGA tournament, that continues at Colonial Country Club in Fort Worth, Texas. Topping the leaderboard, Jordan Smith at 10 under par, followed by a four-way tie for second, and that includes three Americans, Michael Thorpe Bjornsson, Brian Gerard, and Brian Harman. Nailed it. In the NBA playoffs tonight, the Knicks are going to find out who they will play in the finals when the San Antonio Spurs take on the Oklahoma City Thunder. That series tied at 3 apiece. To hockey now, the Carolina Hurricanes, they topped the Montreal Canadiens 6-1, which means they will take on the Vegas Golden Knights in the Stanley Cup Finals on Tuesday. And senior Pentagon leaders are putting together lists of uniformed U.S. service members who will be given the chance to attend that big UFC fight being planned outside of the White House next month. But there's one caveat. CNN reporting tickets will only be given to those who meet military body composition standards. It's part of an ongoing intense focus on physical fitness by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who last year, if you remember, he said there will be no, quote, fat troops or fat generals and the admirals in the halls of the Pentagon. David and Christina.
Not respond to
the
that.
Countdown to the
I'm just going to read the next read.
To behold on Flag Day, the 14th of June, President Trump's birthday.
It is.
Well as
my dad did 20 years in the Army, and I'm going to move on.
All right.
Okay. All right.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa. After a bruising and exceedingly expensive primary campaign that ended with Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton defeating incumbent Senator John Cornyn, the stage is set for what's bound to be a bruising and exceedingly expensive campaign for the Senate seat. Ahead of the general election, where voters are going to choose between Paxton and Democrat James Talarico.
New polling this week shows Talarico with a slight edge over Paxton, but it is a long way until November. Joining us now, two Texas bureau chiefs.
Dueling
David
bureau
Gura,
chiefs here today.
The New York Times' man in Houston, along with our own Julie Fine. She is based in Dallas. Julie, let me start with you. We're going to talk about the polling and the social issues, but just tee this up for us. Let's start with how expensive that primary was and what that portends for this general election campaign.
Well, this general election campaign expect to be well over $100 million. I want to take you back to 2018 when Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz, between the two of them, that was about $120 million. That was 2018. I expect this race to be more expensive when it is all said and done. The Republicans already spent a lot of money going after each other in the primary, so now they have to really get ready for a general election, whereas James Talarico has just had plenty of time to fundraise. He's raised $3 million, his campaign says, since the primary results alone. So expect this to be a lot of money.
David, I want to ask about these kind of dueling narratives, since we've got dueling bureau chiefs. Obviously, Ken Paxton has quite the history, right? He's got ethics concerns. He's got personal life is a bit messy. Republican voters in the primary seem to not be bothered by that. I'm wondering, as you go into the general, if that's going to be a bigger concern. And then I'm also highly amused at the swipes some Republican operatives have been taking at Talarico this week, including accusing him of being a vegan. He is not, for the record, accusing him of having a secret vegan girlfriend. What is going on here, and what are voters really going to care about?
Well, I mean, that remains to be seen. But, it's important to remember that Attorney General Ken Paxton has won several statewide races, statewide general elections in Texas, with a lot of the baggage that he's bringing into this general election already known to the voters. So one of the challenges for Democrats here is going to be, making those issues, salient again. And it's, this argument that, Ken Paxton is unfit for the job and that he has this, messy personal life and history of corruption allegations. That's something that John Cornyn tried in the primary, and it really didn't work at all with Republican voters. And, it may not work here with general election voters either, but that is the tactic that, James Talarico is focused on so far. And he believes that, Ken Paxton hasn't run a general election since 2022. Some of these accusations are, if not new, at least newly adjudicated. His impeachment in 2023 happened, in the interim. So he may be a little bit more vulnerable than in the past. On the other side, what Ken Paxton's trying to do is really make James Talarico seem, un-Texan or sort of other to the voters here. And one of the ways he's doing that is, by using the vegan word. And James Talarico is not a vegan. But it does, it sort of resonates on some level with the idea among Republican voters anyway, that this candidate is outside of the mainstream of what a Texan is. And, it's a bit ironic because, James Talarico is a multi-generational Texan, whereas Ken Paxton moved here from elsewhere. And so, both of them, of course, are Texans now. But this question of what does it mean to be a Texan is at the center of this race.
Julie, pick up on that. I mean, I'm curious how much this is sticking with the general electorate. Is this something that could be solved if James Talarico went to like Lockhart tomorrow and went to Smitty's and Black's and Cruises and got a few plates?
You're so excited to know those names.
Didn't use cutlery, used white bread to eat the barbecue. I mean, is this something that's likely to stick as we move to November, or is it something he can dismiss or get out of voters' minds pretty quickly here, do you think?
Well, I think this is something you're going to see until November. I mean, you talk about going to a barbecue joint and doing that kind of thing. He will have those opportunities to do it. The question really is this going to all be personal attacks and who's more Texan and who's done this or who's done that? Or do they get down to the issues of affordability and the border? So certainly there's time, as my dueling bureau chief knows, it's a long time in politics until that general election. But I expect these themes to come up because they were so prevalent during the primary.
Julie, is there enough barbecue to be eaten, though? When you look at the numbers, this is not a place that elects Democrats, even at a time when there are a lot of folks, based on polling, that are unhappy with the way the country is being run with the Republican majority. It may not matter at the end of the day. And to David's points, the kryptonite of Ken Paxton's, kind of ethics problems, it's old. Voters either know it or don't at this point. Are the numbers there, no matter how well Talarico does, do you think, to actually pull out a victory? Because right now, as we've talked about, Paxton is pulling slightly ahead.
Yeah, I mean, David said it perfectly. A lot is already known about Ken Paxton. John Cornyn really tried to get that out more, but this has been known for a long time, and he continues to get reelected. So you have to keep that in mind. Texas has not elected a Democrat to statewide office since 1994. So James Talarico is really going to have to appeal to moderates and get more people registered to vote. That is something that Beto O'Rourke really tried to do, but only came within 3.
David, I think I speak for all of us. We'd love to see these two men on stage, hashing it out, making their platforms known, trading barbs with one another. What is the likelihood of that happening between now, May, and November?
I would say it's pretty close to zero that scenario plays out. Ken Paxton hasn't, done a debate in a primary or general election for many, many cycles. I think back to 2014 was the last time he was in some kind of on-stage debate. And part of the reason why is that he never has had to do that. He's always been in a kind of pole position in his races. And here as well, I think if we see a debate, it'll be because Republicans are quite worried that they're not getting their message across, and that James Talarico is appealing across party lines in the way that Julie's suggesting. And so we at this point, I can't imagine a scenario where he does agree to a debate. But if we see one, I think it's a signal that Democrats are closer than Republicans want them to be.
Julie, quickly before I let you go, what happens to the Cornyn voters? I mean, we've got a poll that says most of them said they would now choose Paxton, 23% undecided. Do you think Talarico can get enough of them?
That's what Democrats have been trying to do here for years. I think a lot of this depends on, again, how much is on personal issues and how much really does get down to the issues that matter to voters. It is a steep road for any Democrat. As David said, they're certainly going to be trying, but it's going to take a serious amount of effort, and you're going to have to really work to pull those voters over. Many of them, like you pointed out, said they will go ahead and vote for Ken Paxton when they were planning on voting for John Cornyn.
Great to have both of you. Again, 2 Texas bureau chiefs on the show, a first for us.
Dueling,
Let's
if you will.
reprise it as we move to November. Thanks to both of you. Julie Fine, our Texas bureau chief, based in Dallas. David Goodman, who's based in Houston for the New York Times. Thanks to both of you on this Saturday. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. I went to school in Texas.
I know
Good
you've
state.
got Texas bona fides. You could be on there as well. I
We should
think
go
what
down
they
there.
said there at the end, really fascinating. There's talk every cycle about the purpling of Texas. Could it happen? Could we see Democrats make inroads? And Julie, starting us off there talking about Beto O'Rourke. I mean, that was, for me, the last time I recall when it seemed like that was a real viable option for Democrats, of course.
Possibly. It seems like an uphill battle, but again, we got some time, just a little bit of time before November. All right, up next, the newest trend for men, and whether David Gura has hopped on that bandwagon.
Me?
I don't know what it is either. We're going to find out. Lisa's going to tell us. All right, we'll be back in a bit, and if you're heading out the door, take us with you. You can watch us wherever we go. Bloomberg TV, Bloomberg Radio, stream us live, and on the Bloomberg Business app. We'll be right back. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. It is time for BT Dubs. I'm Christina Ruffini here with David Gura, and Lisa Mateo is going to catch us up on some of the stories you might have missed this week. Lisa.
All right. David, are you a fan of cologne?
You know, I'm not.
Do you know?
I don't
think
use
I've ever,
it. No. Thank you all.
awkwardly,
That's really,
yeah.
I really appreciate that.
Nothing.
Maybe I will be after this memorable moment here on the show.
I've never
I'm
noticed
not.
an odor,
I'm
good
not.
or bad,
Thank you.
emanating
All right.
from
Well,
David
that's how
Gura,
I like it.
I
I like to present a neutral posture on this show.
Neutral posture. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you will be surprised because this one in Bloomberg. Okay.
I often am.
It
during
says,
the segment.
thank you. Men are spraying themselves 100 times. It is a fragrance frenzy.
A
okay.
year?
So, no, at once. Okay. So listen to this. There's
Are
an
we in
influencer
Versailles?
out
What is
there.
happening?
Okay. There's an influencer out there, right? He's telling men you have to layer your fragrances, right? Multiple colognes all at once to create your signature scent, okay? So even if it means spraying yourself 100 times in the morning before you head out. His name is Overspray J.
Overspray J.
I mean,
Yeah, to his friends.
this is who we want to be listening to?
He says, if you ain't shining, are you even applying? That's his thing,
That
okay?
it has to be visible.
But you have to be able to do that. The cosmetic companies love it, right? Because
You're buying more bottles
you're
of
buying
this,
more
yeah.
of these, right? But it's not only that. Men are starting to add the lotions. I mean, my husband has the lotion. It has the
Your husband
special
does this? You're revealing
deodorant.
this?
He has not so much the cologne, but the accessories to
Okay,
go with
all
the
right.
spray of cologne. Okay, and some of these are high end. Like a bottle of cologne can be about $400.
$400.
My son has the Creed one that's like $400.
God, the Mateo
I was like,
family is getting called
somebody
out
needs to
this
pitch in
morning
for the
here.
rent.
Lisa.
But so it's becoming like a thing. You have to spray a lot of times, David.
So we use cacophony to describe noises, kind of countervailing noises.
that's a
What's
good
the word
word.
for scents? I mean, it's kind of crazy to apply different types of colognes and lotions, I would think.
I will say, I do this not 100 times, but I do combine perfumes
I was going to
sometimes.
say something.
Yeah, I
haven't
do.
said
Like
it
if one
yet.
is too floral and one is too like manly, I will do like a half a spritz of both, but I didn't know it was a thing and I didn't put that much thought into it.
I can't. I get.
Now
I
we
have
will.
allergies. Can't do it.
Do you ever think about like what your lotion smells like versus what your cologne smells like versus what your deodorant smells like?
Never. No, I don't go that far.
I do that
Sorry.
as well. I will say I do. I do that, but not to this extent.
We'll do a follow-up segment on that.
And I don't wear it at work.
Okay, all right.
Thank you. I do semi it from
You're
here.
welcome, you're welcome.
You know what time of season is? It's graduation season.
It is.
Yeah.
Right? So you have the high school graduations, right? The college graduations. It's also the time. Do you guys get those in the mail? The announcements. Okay, so this
Send
is
a
for the
check.
Washington
Send a
Post.
check announcements.
You nailed it. You nailed
I feel
it.
this way about weddings that they know I'm not going to go to
Yes.
as well. But
Okay,
yes.
so the Washington Post says what to do when a graduation announcement feels like an invoice, okay? So this also applies, but you're right, to baby showers, to weddings, to all those invitations you get. What do you do when you get an announcement. It's not actually an invitation. There's no date and place, and it's just an announcement, okay? So the Washington Post says, you know, are you supposed to get a gift or just be happy? Some come with gift registries, too. I didn't know there was such a thing. Digital payments, there's a Venmo scanned QR code
on that.
on it as well.
Paper announcement.
But the rules, in case you're worried, okay?
According to who?
Washington Post says, treat them as courtesy notices. They do not require gifts, okay? If you attend a graduation party, then yes, the gift. If you're invited but you can't attend, that's another thing.
Yes.
Do you still send the gift? They're saying you don't have to.
You don't have to.
Yes.
I just put them in my scrapbook for the memories.
I mean, but the mission
It's a
creep
lot.
on the kinds of announcements you're getting as well. It's like, we've bought a house, we've rented a new car, we've, you know, decided to buy a new pair of jeans, like the bar for things that people are announcing or celebrating. Like, I appreciate the frivolity of it, but it does seem like there's a fee.
We all got one when you were moving to New York. Christina Ruffini, coming to the greatest city in the world.
I
didn't know what to do with it. Who are you? I wondered.
Do you send a gift?
Fair. That's fair. No, I don't do those things because I think that's, you know, it's my life choices. I don't expect other people to pay for them.
All right, I have 6 parties coming up, just to let you know. Okay, so this was
Today.
from
No,
the
you
weekend.
don't have to go.
This is from the weekend, okay?
Okay.
It says the world's biggest Scrabble tournament in Bangkok. So it's the biggest Scrabble tournament. It's in Thailand, about 450 players, 30 countries competing. So we have Bloomberg's Thailand reporter, Randy Than Thong Knight. He talked about why this board game is so popular in the Southeast Asian country. Listen up.
Part of Thailand's success can be traced back to the classroom. The country's English teaching has long been criticized for focusing heavily on memorization and exams. Lots of learning words and grammar and not much conversation. But those exact skills translate surprisingly well to Scrabble. There's also a broader pattern here. Thailand has long punched above its weight in sports like boxing and weightlifting, areas where smart training can outweigh the advantages of bigger nations. And Scrabble has become one of those arenas. The game was introduced through Thai schools in the 80s, and over time it evolved into something much bigger, a pathway to scholarships and elite universities. So despite ranking relatively low in global English proficiency, Thailand has produced multiple world Scrabble champions and remains the only Asian country to ever do so. And now a new generation is emerging. Among the youngest competitors this weekend are 9-year-old Thai twins who only started playing a little over a year ago and are already competing internationally. At the highest level, Scrabble isn't just about knowing words or having good memory. It's also about strategy and psychology and sometimes pure luck in the draw of the tiles.
Ooh, I love me a good
Do you
Scrabble
love it?
game. I do.
I
I
love
get
to do
competitive.
it.
I get
Yeah.
nasty.
First, shout out to Randy. He
Yes.
shot and did that whole thing for us on very little notice. It was awesome. Randy, that was great.
Yay, Randy.
Second of all, I'm dyslexic, so I'm not playing Scrabble. That's not happening. Thanks, Lisa.
Lisa,
That was a
thank you
good
very much.
question today.
BTW. We are coming up at 9 a.m. in New York.
That's right. Stay with us because the next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts right now.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. We're coming to you live from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Lisa Mateo. It is Saturday, May 30th, and we've got a lot of news for you today from a variety of places around the world. We've got some colleagues who've been tracking everything happening at this defense summit in Asia. Topics du jour are maybe not being said by some American officials. Things not said have been important as things that have been said. And of course, we're tracking what's going on with Iran. The president hunkered down with his officials on Friday, said he was going to come with a decision and emerge without one.
Lo, it hasn't happened. Again, the prism through which we're looking at that, what's happening in the Middle East, is through this Security and Defense Summit that's taking place in Singapore, the Shangri-La Dialogue. The Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth just spoke there. We're going to recap what he had to say as we look ahead to what happens with the conflict in Iran. Before we do that, let's get a check of the headlines with Lisa Mateo. Lisa?
Well, an Iranian ballistic missile strike on a Kuwaiti airbase. It has injured several Americans. The attack also seriously damaged 2 MQ-9 Reaper strike drones. Sources tell Bloomberg Kuwaiti air defenses intercepted the missile, but falling debris, it struck the Ali Al Salem air base. About 5 people, that's including contractors, active duty personnel, they suffered minor injuries. No comment from U.S. Central Command. Now, this all comes as President Donald Trump considers a deal to extend a ceasefire, but still no announcement has been made from the president. After a roughly 2-hour meeting in the Situation Room on Friday, the president is demanding that Iran abandon its nuclear program, give up its enriched uranium supplies, and open the Strait of Hormuz. At the Shangri-La Defense Conference in Singapore, Qatar's deputy prime minister said it opposes permanent legal fees for transit through the strait. But that also added that a temporary toll is negotiable and could actually help restore normal passage through the waterway. Over at the Reagan National Economic Forum in Simi Valley, California yesterday, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent suggested the Trump administration could lift certain sanctions on Iran depending on how the standoff develops.
We put more sanctions on yesterday. We sanctioned their 2 airlines. We've got some other financial targets. There's a lot more that we can do if we have to. And there's some things that we can take off to help the Iranian people.
Bessent also suggested the Treasury will mint a coin with Trump's image on it. That's to mark the nation's 250th anniversary. In other news, President Trump says he's backing away from his proposed renovation of the Kennedy Center and returning control of it to Congress. It comes after a federal judge blocked the Kennedy Center board from closing the performing arts venue and ordered the president's name to be removed from the building. And another setback for the Trump administration, a federal judge has temporarily blocked payment for any claims through a new $1.8 billion settlement fund for the president's allies who believe they were victims of a weaponized government. Now, the judge scheduled a June 12th hearing for arguments on whether to extend that order. David and Christina.
Lisa, thank you very much. Administration acting like that fund is a done deal, but I think between what we're seeing in the courts and what we're likely to see in Congress, Christina, that's not looking like it's going to be the case.
Even a lot of pushback from some of the president's stronger allies on that one. That just seems like a kind of an open-ended thing that makes people have a bit of pause.
Yeah, a bit of pause. Lisa, thank you very much for those headlines. Just to recap here, President Trump leaving that hours-long Situation Room meeting yesterday without a decision on a proposed peace plan with Iran. And as Lisa just mentioned a moment ago, we saw that attack, an Iranian ballistic missile strike on a Kuwaiti airbase that left several Americans with minor injuries, some damages to drones, U.S. drones as well.
Very expensive U.S. drones. All right, back with us is Bloomberg's Mideast breaking news editor and UAE bureau chief, Donna Khraiche, and Bloomberg's weekend senior editor, Wendy Benjaminson. Thank you both so much for joining us. Wendy, I want to start with you. I think I know the answer to this, but have we heard any signs of life, update, movement from the White House this morning as we are still awaiting some form of, if not resolution, movement on a decision from the president and whether or not there is any kind of a short-term deal?
The short answer is no. We haven't heard anything yet, although we are expecting that we will hear from him this morning, particularly as he wakes up or was informed overnight about the injuries that David mentioned to a handful of American troops at a U.S. base in Kuwait. That, given the fact that he apparently wasn't ready to sign this agreement after the discussion in the Situation Room, I don't think this event will push him any closer toward that fact, that toward him, being willing to sign an agreement with Iran, given the fact that there are already all these sticking points. He had a really bad day yesterday. A number of rulings went against him. And I think that he's not going to be in a mood to deal with this today.
Dana, let me ask you just about what movement we've seen. And again, a lot of this is happening, of course, not even behind closed doors, but through papers being shifted back and forth via Pakistani intermediaries. But we know what the White House red lines are. Iran reopening the Strait of Hormuz, Iran surrendering its highly enriched uranium, and Iran ending its nuclear program. We know that well. We also know well that Iran has pushed back against a number of those items. Where is there room for any compromise here? And indeed, are there any signs from the response that we've gotten maybe not directly from the Iranians, but through semi-official news agencies, of where Iran might be willing to budge on this one-page document, on these principles?
That this will all be Sorry.
Dan, I'll go to you first. What did you take a bite after that? But Dan, I'll start with you.
Thank you. I think from Iran's perspective, they're not budging on the one thing that, from what we've seen recently today from Strait-run agencies, is that they're not budging on this Hormuz toll. And today, an Iranian lawmaker said that, there's a bill in parliament and it will be finalized and is on track to be passed into a law. And he said that only Iran and Oman can decide on the management of the Strait of Hormuz, and saying the Omani side has already given preliminary approval. So the Iranians want to open or reopen the Strait of Hormuz, but they want to have some sort of supervisory role over the Strait. And let's remember, this war, I think, really opened Iran's eyes on that leverage in the Strait of Hormuz. For decades they've been saying we can block the Strait, and they never did. And once they did, they understood how much leverage they have, not just over the US, but the global economy. And it's very hard to see them kind of abandon this role that they want to play in. So that's one. And then two, from what analysts have been saying and from what state-run media has been saying, is that this is a win for Iran no matter what, because the US is kind of conceding to their demands. And that's not what President Trump or the US administration wants the Iranian to come out of this as a win or as a winner. And of course, this war has emboldened them so much, and we've seen their capability in just withstanding all pressure, all sanctions, and this naval blockade as well. And a lot of the analysts are saying Iran can play this out as long as it can, and this is also another leverage for them. On the nuclear side, I think the Iranians have said, we can sign an MOU. It's fine if we freeze it, but there is no abandoning of the nuclear program.
Right, and mixed messaging there almost immediately after light reporting that an MOU was in the offing, with the U.S. side saying that nuclear issue is going to be included, and Iran almost immediately saying, not so fast. We've not agreed to that. That's going to be a separate issue after we reopen the Strait. Wendy, I want to broaden out a bit with you, because we've been tracking some news coming out of this Shangri-La conference in Singapore, and the Secretary of Defense is there, and Pete Hegseth has been delivering some interesting messages to allies. I want you to take a listen to one of the things he said during his speech.
Who believe they can continue to free ride on the generosity of the American taxpayer, hear us now. Those days are over. Allies who refuse to step up and carry their own weight for our collective defense will face a clear shift in how we do business.
Wendy, who is he speaking about there? Is there a specific target? Is he talking to European allies who the president was frustrated with not helping deliver the Strait? Is he speaking to Asian allies, given that he is in Asia? Who's the target audience, and how is that message going to land?
Well, I think it was largely at a European audience, because that has been a theme of both Trump administrations, is that NATO isn't doing much for the U.S., and therefore, in their minds, why should we be paying so much for it? Trump did successfully get many nations to up their contribution to NATO at the time. But I think he's also speaking a little bit to the Asian allies, to Japan, for instance, for whom, for the last 70 years, the U.S. has been providing a great deal of defense aid to them. And now that, we're past World War II, the sense is that Japan, who wants to have much more of a military of its own, needs to spend some of that money and step up. So I think that it is mostly at the European allies, but I think there's also a little bit of a, hey, Asia, are you listening sort of mode there.
Dan, I want to go back to kind of the time horizon that we're looking at here. And we've talked many times on this show about the time and effort that went into negotiating that first Iran deal now many years ago. Here we're talking about the prospects of a 60-day extension of this kind of tenuous ceasefire that's been in place here. I'm curious how you see that playing out. Say this were agreed to, say both sides agreed to this. What does it mean for the prospect of the Strait remaining open going forward, for instance? I could envision a future in which Iran says, sure, we'll do this, and then 60 days later or less decides, no, in fact, we're going to renege on that, and things are going to go back to the way that they are presently. How sufficient, I guess, is the question I have, that 60-day extension of this? What does it allow both parties to do in terms of negotiating going forward?
I think this is to give time to discuss the nuclear issue, right? And this is the thorniest issue, is the most critical one for the US and for President Trump. He keeps saying that the JCPOA, which is the deal that President Obama secured with Iran, that this was not a very good deal, and he wants to negotiate this. But I think the Obama deal kind of took over a year to secure, and 60 days might not be very sufficient to kind of negotiate what to do with Iran's nuclear program. And this is quite critical for everyone involved. I think when it comes to Hormuz, we've seen what countries like the UAE has started to do. They have accelerated a second pipeline to export their oil outside of Hormuz. They have now, if that pipeline goes into effect, which they say it will start operating in 2027, then they wouldn't need Hormuz to export their oil. You have seen Saudi Arabia that has the East-West pipeline that goes through the Red Sea. They can export through there. Countries are thinking of ways to bypass Hormuz, and which would mean even if Iran has a toll system, might not be able to make a lot of money out of it. There are countries that could have it more difficult, like Kuwait, Iraq, and even Qatar. But what the UAE is doing with that second pipeline shows you that a lot of countries are looking for alternative ways. They don't want to use Hormuz eventually. Because like you said, even if let's say the 60 days expire with no agreement on the nuclear issue, then that means we're back to square one. We're back to this frozen war, like we've seen with what happened with the Kuwaiti, with the US base in Kuwait. It's not just Iran that's targeting the Gulf countries. It's of course the Iraqi militias. They could be behind this Kuwait airbase, as has been the case before. We saw 2 weeks ago, UAE blamed them for attacking its own nuclear power plant here in Abu Dhabi. So it's all very fluid, and there is no certain situation that after that 60 days, if they don't really come to an agreement on, the nuclear issue, war might resume. Israel also can be seen as a wild card here because the nuclear program is seen as an existential threat to the Israelis. So they might not like a deal that the US or Iran could come to. There are so many moving parts here, and just a 60-day might not actually, end the war as we see it.
Wendy, the Pentagon has said that they are ready to restart if needed to at the call of the president. But there's also a lot of reporting around what this conflict has done for U.S. military readiness overall. And as we see these military officials and diplomats in Asia talking about Asian security and the defense of America's allies, that Taiwan aid package is still being held back. And now Pete Hegseth said we should uncouple that from the two. The U.S. has the capacity to do both. But there has been a degradation of these, weapons that the U.S. has used in the Middle East. How does that impact this administration's security priority goals in other theaters, especially the Western Hemisphere, where the president seems to have an interest in expanding U.S. reach, and also Asia, where the United States needs to at least counter China with some of its allies?
Absolutely, Christina. Well, look, it has a spillover effect. I mean, there isn't an inexhaustible supply of missiles in the U.S. arsenal. We have a lot of missiles, but not in an inexhaustible supply. And we've been using them a lot in the last 4 months in the Iran war, really depleting our stockpiles. And that does leave Taiwan more vulnerable if China were to choose to attack Taiwan at this point. There are some experts who worry about whether the U.S. will be able to vigorously defend Taiwan if such a conflict were to last. And we've seen reports over the last few days, as you noted, of how the U.S. wants to help Guatemala with drug trafficking, and it wants to help Honduras with drug trafficking in the hopes that Mexico will then ask for help with drug trafficking, which also means not Tomahawk missiles, I would hope, but it does mean a lot of U.S. munitions and a lot of military activity, like kinetic activity, in a lot of different theaters at once, which, the U.S. military is large and capable, but that's spreading the country thin a little bit.
Yeah, we've got about a minute left. I want to ask you sort of what's happening currently in the Strait of Hormuz. We mentioned a little while back, we heard from the CEO of Chevron saying that company's not interested in paying tolls. It would not pay tolls, I think he said unequivocally. Bloomberg is reporting that at least 2 ship owners who asked not to be identified have said that they're in communication with U.S. officials, that CENTCOM is effectively providing advice to commercial ships in the Strait to help them navigate through there. What's the latest that we have on that level of transit that's taking place in that waterway right now as, again, we wait for the president to make some determination here?
I think ship tracking data, and this is from our own reporting, is showing that at least a quarter of the non-Iranian ships stranded in Hormuz since the war began back in February 28 have made their way out. And so this is some hope, or making some ship owners become more optimistic that they can, pass through Hormuz. There's some pickup in traffic there. We've seen 2 more vessels leaving the waterway after the U.S. provided them with information about the exit itself. Some ships that belong to certain companies hadn't even transited since the war started and were entering and leaving. We have also data that shows some of them are coming and going. And of course, the UAE has sent ships through as well. And Qatar is quietly, of course, exporting LNG to key buyers. This is from our own original reporting about 2 weeks ago. So there is some traffic here and there. And Iran on a daily basis is saying, 20 ships have crossed through the Strait. So there is some movement there, but for the oil market, I doubt this is enough to kind of bolster prices.
Sure.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Dana Khraiche and Wendy Benjaminson, thank you both so much for joining us. Different perspectives from different sides of the world. We appreciate it.
Coming up here, Cisco's focus on artificial intelligence. Lisa and I sat down with the company's president and chief product officer ahead of a major conference. That's straight ahead on Bloomberg this weekend, right here on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, streaming, of course, at Bloomberg.com and on the Bloomberg Business app. Stay with us. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm David Gura with Christina Ruffini. Cisco was once seen as the company powering the internet. Now it wants to power the AI boom as well. Investors are betting that the next phase of artificial intelligence won't just be about chips, but about networks, security systems, and infrastructure connecting them all.
Cisco Systems has expanded its data centers, saying the future of AI might depend less on chatbots and more on AI agents operating at a company level. Lisa and David spoke with Jeetu Patel, President and Chief Product Officer, about what part networking systems will play in the future development of AI.
We are on the verge of entering into what we call a networking supercycle. And you can see it in our results over the course of the past few years as well. There's been a tremendous amount of momentum. And the reason for that is, if you take a step back and say, what's happening in the market right now, there's 2 major phenomena that are occurring that are very, very poignant to what we're talking about. The first one is that we're moving from chatbots to agents. So these agents can conduct tasks and jobs for us almost fully autonomously. And these agents tend to be far more consumptive in their patterns of usage on network bandwidth compared to humans. And so while a human might use X amount of network bandwidth to conduct a task, an agent does 450% more to conduct the same task. And so you just need more network bandwidth than what you would have otherwise. And there's going to be trillions of agents around the world. So that's the first major kind of shift that's happening. The second one is we're living in a world that's post-mythos, which is the model that Anthropic had built that actually can really help with identifying vulnerabilities at a much faster pace with an infrastructure. And in that world, what you're going to start to see is, protecting infrastructure and having security and safety be something that's actually organized at machine scale is a very important thing. So these 2 dynamics, and then the third one being physical AI, which is right around the corner, make networking at the center of it all. So you'll see that inferencing is much more, or just as much, network and memory constrained as it is compute constrained.
No, we want to ask you about Mythos, but before we get there, let me just ask you how Cisco is kind of transforming its business to deal with the kind of demand, the super cycle that you're talking about. I imagine that's manifest in all of the data center demand that we're seeing across this country and around the world. What are you doing differently? How are you meeting that demand as a company?
Yeah, one of the things that we've been very, very focused on is making sure that as the demand explodes, that we've actually gotten our supply chain in order as well. The good news about Cisco is we are one of the few companies in the world that are fully vertically integrated platforms. So we make our own silicon, we make our own optics, which is what communicates the data between chips within a data center or even across data centers that might be hundreds of kilometers apart. And then we make our own hardware and systems, and then our own operating system and software and platforms around security and observability. So you've got a full stack. And one of the things that we had to do is get ahead and make sure that we can start forecasting, because if you just look at last quarter, our product orders on a base of 63 billion grew 35%. Wow. So there's a tremendous amount of kind of momentum in the business. We've seen that reflected in our stock price, of course, which I don't check every day, but it's important to know that when there's that much demand signal, you have to make sure that it becomes a supply constrained world, and you have to keep the supply going, which is where we are focused quite a bit on, in addition to the technology innovation that we continue to keep moving faster than I've ever seen a company this size move before.
Excellent. G2, I have to go back to mythos, and I'm glad you said it, because it's been this mythos.
Yes.
Which is it?
We'll follow your lead on that pronunciation.
It's a proper noun. You can pronounce it whatever way you want.
You are one of the few companies who has gotten their hands on this. So what have you learned? Are you more worried, less concerned? What are your thoughts on it at this point?
Well, one of the things that is important is as AI becomes more and more prominent, Mythos happens to be a catalytic event, but if you just look in general, what we've had over the past 30 years is this notion where the adversary, the bad folks, have always had an advantage over the defenders, who are the good folks. And the reason for that is because the adversary has to be right once, the defender has to be right every single time. This is the first time that you might actually see that if we can coordinate ourselves, and companies can coordinate themselves to say, I'm going to make sure that my defenses are machine scale rather than human scale. And we can actually have a time advantage, because Mythos was made available to companies like us before it got made available to the world at large, which is when the bad folks get a hand on it. You could start to see an asymmetric move where the defenders might have an asymmetric advantage over the adversaries over time.
A big question I think that's front of mind for everybody is what AI is going to do to the labor force. And I saw that Cisco announced plans to have some layoffs soon. And I'm curious, is that tied into the AI story? How do you think about the way that AI is dislocating the workforce and how it might going forward?
Yeah, so the restructuring that we announced actually had nothing to do with cost efficiency. It was more around reallocation of dollars, where we wanted to make sure that we put the dollars in higher growth areas, so that we will actually see an increase in OPEX, not a decrease year over year as we move forward. So we're investing in the business rather than taking away from it, just to be very clear. As you start to think about the job situation and what people have talked about, the common concerns have been, well, AI is going to take all jobs. We're going to be sitting on a beach staring at the ocean. AI is going to do everything for us. What we've found is actually exactly the opposite. As you know, we're one of the largest users from a coding perspective. We have 30,000 engineers, over 30,000 engineers, and they all use Codex from OpenAI as well as Claude Code to go out and write code. We, in fact, have our first product that's now written 100% with AI, and we're going to have about half a dozen products by the end of the year that will be 100% written with AI. And by the end of next year, 70% of all of our code will be written with AI. And the things that we're finding that are surprising and counterintuitive is, with all this code written with AI, we are seeing many, many more human bottlenecks than not. And so I actually think, maybe this is contrarian in the thinking, I think you will see an increase in jobs rather than a decrease in jobs because of AI. But what you will see is a lot of reconfiguration of how jobs are actually being done. And that's something that the delta between someone who is AI fluent and someone who's not AI fluent is not going to be a 20% gap or productivity. It's going to be like 50x.
Wow. And
so the people that know AI well will be in exceptionally high demand. And that's actually going to continue to persist. I don't think that changes in state.
I have to ask you, Cisco used to get painted with the same brush as memory, kind of cyclical, slow and low. What would you say now? Because it seems like it's not the case. I mean, is this a new era for Cisco?
You know, when I took over the job of running all products 2 2 years ago, I had said in a year, you will see Cisco look very different. In 2 years, we'll be unrecognizable. It does help to have 270 billion added to the market cap. But I will say this, that fundamentally, the way in which we are operating and the way in which we are innovating is at a, we like to think of ourselves as one of the world's largest startups. And it's truly the case. And what you're seeing right now is not just cyclicality, it is a secular shift. And when that kind of secular shift happens, where you have a platform shift of AI being something which is not just a technology that's added, these are digital co-workers that become additional teammates in our teams, which increase capacity for the corpus of humanity by 1,000x. It becomes a very, very different kind of dynamic, because all the assumptions you have around the infrastructure aren't temporarily changed, they're permanently changed on what level of throughput you're going to need. And that actually is going to create a networking kind of super cycle in our mind. And it's already created an infrastructure super cycle.
Before we let you go, we're talking to you on the eve of Cisco Live in Las Vegas, big event for you and the company. Can you give us any sneak peek of what you plan to debut there, or what you think the focus of that conference is going to be this year? Give us something.
Come on.
I was told that I need to give you folks some kind of exclusive, so I'll try to do that. But we have 25,000 of our closest customers that tend to come and assemble in Vegas, and we try to do once a year the entire kind of what are the new innovations that we're coming out with. And it's for our most loyal customers and the ones who are really, really focused on running their businesses on us. What we've found is, as you've seen this kind of super cycle for infrastructure, the way in which organizations manage infrastructure has actually not kept up. And so it's very complex to manage infrastructure. So I think you should expect to see a fundamentally different way with AI and agents that infrastructure gets managed for organizations, and dramatically simplifies that. The exclusive I'll give you, though, is we're going to have a whole new era of switches and routers and firewalls and Wi-Fi access points for updating the infrastructure. Because up until now, what was happening was the constraints were largely in the data center, but where you needed to do things. But now what's happening with inferencing is it's no longer just constrained to the data center. Data centers and hyperscalers are moving at a really fast pace. We're growing triple digits on that side of the house for AI workloads. But when you come to even people sitting at their desks that have a laptop will have a Mac Mini by themselves, and they'll have 100 agents starting to do work. Now imagine that gets to be the common way that everyone does work. You're going to have trillions of agents, and these agents are going to create so much more traffic, and it's going to require so much more security and inspection that we feel like the entire networking apparatus has to get upgraded, and that's what we're actually announcing. So don't tell me that I didn't give you the exclusive, but that's something that's only for Bloomberg.
We will take it. Cheeto, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
See what happens when I'm not here? I will say, I didn't think he was going to give it to you there for a minute.
It's the buildup.
It's a lot of tease,
Yeah.
but good job, guys.
Yeah, echoing what Mandeep told us earlier, the fact that these companies are kind of changing their tack to embrace AI.
Yes.
And hardware and AI having a bit of a moment.
Yes.
It says routers and switches.
Yes.
Routers and switches. And this event is huge for them. I mean, they have a huge party, like Maroon 5 performing. Like, it's a big, big event for them in Vegas.
All right, Maroon 5.
I will not sing. I will not sing.
Thank you.
Lisa, thank you. Got headlines for us?
We do.
All right.
Let's get to some of those top stories. All right, well, with no update on a ceasefire with Iran, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, he spoke about the conflict outside of the Shangri-La Defense Conference in Singapore.
And I had a chance to talk to President Trump this morning. He wanted me to reiterate how patient he is in ensuring that with America undertaking this kind of historic endeavor, any deal will be a good one, a great one. And he's patient in the pursuit of that because of how the implications of how that sorts out.
Hegseth also assured Pacific allies that Washington remains committed to the region, while at the same time, he took swipes at long-standing partners in Europe. Well, former Attorney General Pam Bondi, she refused to answer questions on President Donald Trump's involvement in the release of the Jeffrey Epstein case files. It happened during a closed-door questioning. Democratic lawmakers say the fight is not over. And the world's biggest social media platforms, well, they've agreed to pay about $27 million to settle a lawsuit filed by a rural Kentucky school district. The suit claims their products are addictive and helped create a teen mental health crisis that drains school resources. Records show Meta is paying the largest share, followed by Snap, TikTok, and Google's YouTube. More than 1,300 other school districts, well, they have filed similar lawsuits and are awaiting trial. We'll be right back. Stay right here with Bloomberg This Week and Bloomberg's Matt Campbell. He's the author of The Man Who Stole the Gods. We'll have that interview coming right up. Stay tuned. Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's update you on today's top stories. Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin is assessing damage to its Florida launch pad after its New Glenn rocket exploded during a test flight firing Thursday night. Emergency officials, they are warning the public to avoid any wreckage that might wash ashore and instead call 911. New Glenn is the rocket that Blue Origin plans to use to launch landers to the moon for NASA. And Pizza Hut, well, they may be under new ownership. Sources telling Bloomberg Yum Brands is in exclusive talks to sell the pizza chain to Long Range Capital. Long Range reportedly entered exclusivity with Yum in recent days and beating out bidders including Sycamore Partners. In sports, another tennis great has been knocked out of the French Open after a surprise upset from Jannik Sinner on Thursday. Novak Djokovic is now out of the running. He was defeated by Brazilian teenager Joao Fonseca. Also out, all the men's major winners. And the PGA tournament continues at Colonial Country Club in Fort Worth, Texas. Topping the leaderboard, Jordan Smith at 10 under par, followed by a four-way tie for second, and that includes three Americans, Michael Thorpe-Jordan, Ryan Gerard, and Brian Harman. To the NBA playoffs tonight, the Knicks will find out who they will play in the finals when the San Antonio Spurs, they take on the Oklahoma City Thunder. That series tied at 3 apiece. To hockey now, where the Carolina Hurricanes, they top the Montreal Canadiens 6-1, which means, yes, they will take on the Vegas Golden Knights in the Stanley Cup Finals on Tuesday. David and Christina, David, you've actually been to a Stanley Cup Finals.
Yeah, no, I've been to Stanley Cup Finals. I'm from North Carolina. The notion that there
That's
is
not a
great
hockey state.
in North Carolina is still very weird to me, and probably grates on some Canadian colleagues. But anyways, we'll see what happens. But
You're an enigma, David Gura.
I am an enigma, wrapped in one. But go Knicks. Excited about that as well, Lisa, as I know you are.
Yes, very. All right, you two. That's enough sports talk for one broadcast. All right. Thanks, Lisa. Okay, David Gura, we went to the Met Gala this year.
Well, we didn't go to, you went to the gala. I went to the preview of the Met Gala.
You were Met Gala adjacent. All right, stick with me here.
Okay.
In 2018, Kim Kardashian, yes, I know, wore this sparkly gold dress to the Met Gala. And when she was inside, she decided to pose next to a sarcophagus that looked a bit like her dress. There's the dress. You can see it. And we've got a picture of this sarcophagus. She then posted it to Instagram. Then this happens. It turned out the coffin had been looted during the Arab Spring. Someone recognized it because the tweet went so viral, reported it, and it was repatriated back to its home in Egypt. Look, works of arts and antiquities often go missing in times of war or unrest. Sometimes they get snatched by invaders or colonizing forces. Sometimes they're looted by regimes looking for cash or ways to almost alter historical narratives about the people or a history. And that was the case in Cambodia, where one man was at the center of a sprawling global art conspiracy.
Wow, from the Kardashians to that.
I told you we'd get there. I told you we'd get there.
Very good. Our colleague Matt Campbell has written this story, actually the book about how he was exposed and taken down. Matt joins us now. Matt, great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you like that preamble.
The man who
Kim
stole the
Kardashian,
gods.
The man who stole the gods.
That's right.
Let's start with the object at the center of this story. What is it, and how did the principal character in your book come to identify it, and how did this become an obsession of his?
The objects at the center of this story are these amazing artworks from Cambodia, from the civilization that produced Angkor Wat, which a lot of people will have seen pictures of or even visited.
This is the Tomb Raider temple.
Exactly,
Yeah.
precisely. That's actually a slightly different place, very close to Angkor Wat, but
Oh, I
that's
know
the
that.
idea.
Okay, sorry.
And basically there was a lot of demand for these in the U.S., particularly starting in the 70s and 80s. people paying really top dollar, millions and millions of dollars for these amazing stone and bronze artworks. And where there is demand in an illicit market, someone will find a way to meet it. And in that case, it was looters working, some of them affiliated with the Khmer Rouge, during the civil war in Cambodia.
So how did this start? And you focus on this Harvard lawyer named Bradley Gordon, who's kind of in his office and basically just reads an article about how all these Cambodian artifacts are not in Cambodia and makes it his mission. How did he do that? And then where did it end up?
Brad Gordon is a really remarkable character, an American lawyer, lived in Cambodia for a long time, did normie corporate law stuff, but happened to read about one of these investigations. The DOJ had gotten interested in this topic around 2010.
So not by training Indiana Jones?
Not at all. Not in the least. And if you meet him, he's definitely not by training in Indiana Jones. But he thought it was interesting. And he called up some contacts, got put in touch with the DOJ, and was hired as a consultant. And it turned out that what federal prosecutors in New York City needed from him was to go around Cambodia looking for witnesses, and he certainly found them.
There's a piece of sculpture here that Sotheby's intends to put on sale. That's how all of this kind of gets kicked off. And maybe you could talk a bit about that. You mentioned the demand for this kind of artwork, how looters fulfilled that demand. But auction houses have been kind of facilitating it for many years now. And you referenced this U.S. prosecution here. That was against the Sotheby's auction house. What did they contend as this kind of became in prosecutors' crosshairs?
So one of the big cases in the book involves a forfeiture action, not actually a criminal prosecution, against Sotheby's, where the government was trying to seize this statue called the Duryodhana. And basically, auction houses, museums, big collectors had been transacting with these pieces for decades, and were doing so until pretty recently. And these objects came with paperwork that was either non-existent or in many cases just forged. And if anyone had bothered to ask even basic questions like, where did this huge statue that nobody has ever seen before come from at a time when the country where it came from is convulsed by civil war, things would have turned out a bit differently.
You said something to me when we were talking about this earlier this week. Tim, can you put back up that photo that you just had, the big one of the big statues in the room? Because if you look at this photo for our TV audiences, you can see at the base of these statues, there's a line across the feet. See, if the statues, there's a line across the ankles and the feet. Can you explain to us why that's there?
The reason a lot of these statues are missing their feet is because the feet were broken off when they were stolen. And actually, there are a number of pieces in the book, including this Sotheby's statue known as the Duryodhana, which Sotheby's was trying to sell for about $3 million, where archaeologists were able to find the feet in place from the temples where they were stolen from during the height of the Khmer Rouge era. And obviously, if you can match up the origin, if you can get witnesses testifying to when it came out, that's pretty embarrassing, and it's also a legal problem in the U.S.
So there were literally just like random feet in these temples where they'd broken them off and shipped them to these auction houses.
These are huge pieces. They're very heavy.
Yeah.
They are sculpted straight into the walls or straight onto the floor of ancient structures, so you have to get them out. You can use chisels, you can use construction equipment like jackhammers, or you can just use dynamite. And Cambodia, after 30 years of civil war, had plenty of explosives around.
Wow.
Last question here. I wonder if you could kind of situate this in the moment that we're in. I want to bring us full circle back to the Kardashians, but let's go back to the Met. And Christina and I did talk to the director and CEO of the Met, and it's an institution that's really been grappling with this matter, maybe not in the context of Cambodia, but with other countries where works of art have been plundered and brought to the collections there. And the Met, like many other museums,
British Museum,
going through an intensive process of trying to get some of that artwork back to these countries. How vibrant is that right now among museums? How roiling an issue is this for major museums around the world and for other art collections as well?
This is a really live issue for museums, for private collectors, for auction houses. The Met has been more public than most in grappling with it. They did a deal with the Department of Justice to return some pieces to Cambodia after a lot of the investigations I describe in the book. They've appointed a team to look into the provenance of their collection, but the Met has millions and millions of objects. You could have 100 people working on this for their whole lives, and they would not get that far in terms of the whole collection. So they have to prioritize. But certainly there's an activist community and people in law enforcement who are pushing them to do so.
Matthew Campbell. The book is The Man Who Stole the Gods, which is a very excellent title.
Thank you.
And you told me the audiobook is coming out next week?
Everything will be out on Tuesday, June 2nd in the U.S., audio, Kindle, hardcover.
Do you narrate the book? No.
I do not.
Okay.
They give you the option, but it's like 4 weeks.
It's very arduous.
I've heard it's
fun.
brutal. I've heard it's really, really tough.
So you have to really want to do it.
All right, fair enough. You would have been great, but I understand.
The Man Who Stole the Gods. Thank you again. Great to see you here. You're not based in New York. You're based in Singapore, so it's a real treat to see you here in New York. And Christina, I just have been thinking back on that tour that we took around the museum, and to Matt's point, how vast that collection is. We had free reign in the museum on a Wednesday.
It was
when it
amazing.
Was closed,
Yeah.
But as the director told us, there were so many objects and works of art.
And they're trying to
not on
highlight and
display.
elevate works from all around the world, but you've got to make sure that you've gotten them properly,
Yes.
and the provenance is accurate, and they've been obtained fairly. So,
all right, Matt, thank you again.
lots
Great to
unpack.
see you. For more reviews, recommendations, be sure to subscribe to the new On Books newsletter from our colleagues at Bloomberg Weekend. You can sign up at bloomberg.com/newsletters.
And up next, it is time for, I haven't studied for this at all this week. It is time for our Pointed News Quiz. David is coming up from behind, doing well. He will try to best me once again. But take us with you no matter where you go, online, on TV, streaming, radio. We'll be right back.
Well. It is time once again for this weekend's Pointed News Quiz. Lisa Mateo, quiz master, is here.
Lisa, be nice to us this
Be
week,
nice.
please.
I don't know. I'm just still stuck on the fact that in the last block you said you didn't have a chance to study. I didn't realize that that's a thing that you do, Christina.
She
for
does.
this
Yes,
week in
you
and week
always
out.
accuse me of malfeasance, but I do go through the terminal and I literally click on the most random stories I can find in preparation for the.
It's not malfeasance. It's just method. Curious about the method that goes into.
Well,
preparing
there's
for
no
this.
method today. There's no method today.
Mostly madness.
It's
Lisa,
all madness.
where are we? Tell us a bit
are-
about the game. We should
I'm
say.
so sorry, guys. This is okay. Here we go. Let's get right to it. Here, for those of you playing at home,
Preemptive apology is
here
worrisome
are
to
the
me.
rules. Okay, there are going to be 3 categories. They each have 30 chips in front of them. They're going to base how they place those chips on each category based on how confident they feel. All right, you feeling confident pretty good?
Well, what are the categories?
Okay,
Let's do that first.
First category is Wexit.
Don't know what that is.
This
is going really well. All right.
Category is Hungary.
Okay.
And the third category, food and beverage.
Okay.
So
I'm
are we
feeling
going
very
even
hungry
across the
myself,
board?
but
Oh,
I'm
we're
gonna-
No. Okay,
Yes. He's putting all on,
On
food and beverage.
Food and beverage.
Wait, really?
Yes. Yeah.
I think he is in for quite a treat.
I'm doing
okay.
the usual. I'm
All right.
gonna split all the way
You're
across.
splitting all the way?
I have no confidence. So
I think I already know who the winner is. Here we go.
Wow.
Okay, let's start with Wexit. Okay, a Canadian premier called for a quote referendum on a referendum to determine if which province
Now I
should
feel like I
hold
should not
a
have done
vote
that,
to
but-
secede. Which province is it? What is the name of this province?
I should have adjusted my chips.
Oh, well, you don't lose.
I don't
you
lose.
You
No,
didn't
I
beat, you
guess
know,
I can still gloat, which I'm fine doing.
with your good hand.
Yeah.
Are we ready, Christina?
Yes. 3,
Yes.
2,
2, 1.
1.
Go ahead. Quebec?
Alberta.
Alberta, correct. It's
Alberta.
It is Alberta.
Alberta?
Wait.
Alberta, yeah.
So Wexit, western exit. Alberta being the westernmost of the so-called prairie provinces.
I didn't even know this was a thing. I gotta brush up on my
Hand him
game.
over,
Yeah, let's hand
Christina.
him over. I don't know. Let's see.
Just be mine now.
Do you see this man is so excited.
I have your
Journey
chips.
to victory.
All right.
All right.
So
No,
far,
I feel like
you're
Wow.
feeling. Oh, he's feeling good now.
Feeling
Okay.
good, but we're not. But yeah.
Let's
all right.
go to Hungary.
You got no points for that, Captain.
None.
He didn't, but he keeps his 30. All right, all
just his
right.
pride.
Hungary.
Hungary.
Under the leadership of Peter Magyar, Hungary withdrew its decision to exit which global organization? What is the name of that organization?
Say it one more time.
Sure.
Sorry.
He withdrew his decision to exit which global organization? This is Peter Magyar, Hungary.
It must
What
have been
did they
something that
withdraw?
Orban had them join.
Oh.
There was a
yeah.
certain name of an organization
I
that
don't
they
know.
had to withdraw
I.
their decision to exit.
All right.
It's a tough one.
It's a tough one.
Yeah.
Wow.
You never know.
You never
This could
know.
be
That
your
is
day.
true.
This
You
could
never
be your
know.
day.
That's
We're
my motto
erasing.
on
Oh,
this.
she's erasing.
Yo,
she's
she's
erasing.
erasing.
I'll say it again.
Well, we've done it. You don't have to do it.
It's
again.
fine. It's
Okay.
fine.
You
Go
get
ahead.
it?
Ready?
Okay, go for it. David, what do you put?
The WHO.
No.
Not NATO.
Not NATO. The answer is the International Criminal Court,
Of course.
the ICC.
Oh, the ICC.
Yes,
Well.
organization that wanted Netanyahu arrested for alleged war crimes in the Gaza Strip. So yes, ICC. Christina, I get another. You're quick to grab our
I just
chips
don't
and
want to
bring
make
them
sure
over
that
here.
everything's accounted for those watching on TV. I mean, where you can dupe the radio listeners by not having visibility into the chips. But I should say for the radio listeners, Christina now has a deficit.
She does. She has a small little 10 pile on the next category. David, you have a massive 30 pile on food and beverage.
Food and beverage.
Are you ready for it? Okay.
I am.
American demand for which natural sweetener grew 10% this year, raising prices and increasing imports to the U.S. It is a natural sweetener. What is the name of this natural sweetener
gone
that
with the
grew
David Gura
10%
method.
this year?
All right, I'm ready.
You ready?
Yeah.
That was quick. Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Agave?
Agave.
Agave. No, it's honey.
Oh!
David, you lost. No, but you both lost.
Yeah, there's no...
If I go down, as long as I take him with me, I'm equally happy.
In terms of correct answers, I did get... I know we had the same amount.
But
It's 1-1.
wait, we do have a tiebreaker. Okay, hold on. Let me get
True
the bonus.
tiebreaker.
True tiebreaker.
I
says
am
the controller
loving all
in
these
our ear.
chips
You
today.
are.
Lisa,
Wow.
please
We've got a minute left here. How many do we have?
All right.
Minute and a
Yes,
half?
okay.
Sorry.
Time pieces is the bonus.
Time pieces.
Okay, ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
What is the name of the, hold here, Audemars Piguet and Swatch collaboration so popular that it caused crowd safety concerns? What is the name of that
The collaboration?
Yes.
I think it looks stupid.
Yeah.
Audemars Piguet and Swatch. They had a collaboration. What is the name of it?
Okay,
It
you
caused
ready?
crowd safety concerns.
David, you're
David.
writing too much. That's too much writing.
I wrote the futuristic pocket watch.
What?
Isn't it
No.
Pop?
Close.
No, see, we don't do close on this show.
we do-
We don't do that.
I'll give her half a point. It's Royal Pop.
Oh, well,
That's
if only
it.
she'd gotten it all. No,
is
I think
pop.
what an
I'll give her
interesting...
10.
Hey, what?
Casualty.
They're going crazy.
Okay,
All
we
right.
will be adjudicating this.
Yeah, in the
to a
ICC,
board.
maybe.
Yeah,
We'll
ICC.
go to the
This is.
ICC.
I feel like that was a half a win.
That was a half a win.
Royal Pop.
Ah, who knew? I'm not a big fan of it, but people were
not
lining
either.
up for these.
It was really out of control. I mean, they had to not open several of the stores because the situation outside was concerning for staff member safeties.
All right.
Don't wait in line, folks. Don't wait in line for food. Don't wait in line for shops.
Don't wait in line to try to test your knowledge on all 10 questions in the Pointed News Quiz, which you can take at Bloomberg.com/pointed. As Christina's fond of reminding everyone, they are multiple choice
Yes.
on the app and online. Thank you
They are.
all. Thanks to Lisa Mateo. Thanks
You're
to all of
welcome.
you for joining us on Bloomberg this week, and we hope you'll join us starting at 7 o'clock Wall Street time tomorrow. We're going to be joined by former National Security Advisor and U.S. Ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, to see if
right.
we have any progress on the president's final determination before we sit down with Ambassador Bolton tomorrow.
Lots to talk about all Iran, all things. We will be here. We hope you'll join us. I'm Christina Ruffini, along with Lisa Mateo. For our listeners on Bloomberg Radio, Masters in Business is up next. And if you're watching us on TV, Wall Street Week with David Weston starts right now.
Royal.